Welcome, fellow wanderer of the endless seas, to the deepest chronicle of bonds, forged in tragedy and tempered by dreams. Tonight, we trace the origins of 9 souls who would become legends not through conquest, but through the simple act of choosing each other as family. These are the hidden stories that shaped the Straw Hat Pirates. Tales of childhood trauma transformed into unshakable loyalty, of dreams born from loss, and of hearts that refused to break despite carrying burdens too heavy for their years. So settle in. Let the gentle rhythm of ocean waves carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore the shadows that created the light, the sorrows that birthed the joy, and the individual journeys that converged into something far greater than the sum of their parts. In the year 1977, on a small island in the East Blue where windmills turned lazily against endless skies, a child was born who would one day shake the very foundations of the world. Monkey D. Luffy entered existence not with the fanfare that might befit a future legend, but with the simple cry of any newborn. In the peaceful village of Fushia, where fishing boats bobbed in gentle harbors and life moved with the rhythm of tides. Yet even in his earliest breaths, this child carried within his blood the conflicting legacies of 2 titans: the revolutionary fervor of Dragon, the most wanted man in the world, and the unwavering marine justice of Garp, the hero whose fists had cornered even the Pirate King himself. His earliest years were marked not by prophecy or portent, but by the curious intensity that would define his entire existence. Even as a toddler, Luffy possessed an energy that seemed to burn brighter than other children, a restless spirit that viewed every wall as something to climb, every rule as something to question, every adult warning as an invitation to discover what lay beyond the forbidden. The villagers of Fushia would later remember how he could never sit still, how his laughter echoed through their streets like music, how he befriended every stray dog and spoke to every stranger as if they were old companions waiting to share adventures. But it was the arrival of his grandfather that would first introduce young Luffy to the harsh realities that lay beyond his island paradise. Vice Admiral Garp came not with toys or gentle bedtime stories, but with a philosophy forged in the crucible of marine service and tempered by decades of witnessing the worst that humanity could offer. To Garp, love was best expressed through strength, kindness through preparation for a world that would show no mercy to the weak. His methods would have been considered barbaric by most standards, yet they sprang from genuine affection twisted by the understanding that softness could prove fatal in the world his grandson would eventually inhabit. The training that followed would have broken most children, yet somehow only seemed to forge Luffy's spirit into something more unbreakable. Garp would throw his 4-year-old grandson into the jungle and leave him to find his own way home, reasoning that a boy who could survive alone among wild beasts would never be helpless in the world of men. He would tie Luffy to balloons and release him into the sky, teaching him that falling was only failure if you refused to get back up. Most memorably, he would suspend the boy over ravines while lecturing him about the importance of self-reliance, as if the proximity to death might awaken some deeper understanding of life's precious nature. These experiences, which might have traumatized another child into fearful submission, instead seemed to teach Luffy that the world was vast and full of possibilities, that every challenge was simply another adventure waiting to be conquered. Where other children might have learned to fear the unknown, Luffy learned to embrace it with arms spread wide. Where others might have developed caution born from painful experience, he developed an absolute faith in his ability to overcome whatever obstacles lay ahead through sheer determination and the kind of optimism that bordered on the supernatural. It was this fearless curiosity that would lead him to the dock on that fateful morning when the red-haired pirates made landfall in Fuchsia village. Shanks and his crew represented everything that Luffy had never encountered in his small world. Freedom personified, adventure made manifest, the living embodiment of dreams too large for any single island to contain. They were men who sailed where they pleased, who answered to no authority save their own conscience, who treated the vast ocean not as a barrier but as a highway to infinite possibility. Their very presence seemed to make the air itself more vibrant, charged with the electricity of lives lived without compromise. Young Luffy was immediately captivated by these pirates, who seemed to carry the wind itself in their sails. He would spend entire days at Party's bar, listening with wide eyes as they told stories of islands where it snowed upward, of fish that could fly through clouds, of treasures hidden in places so remote that the maps themselves had been forgotten by time. But more than their tales, it was their spirit that called to something deep within his soul, the way they laughed at danger, the way they treated friendship as the most sacred bond, the way they never seemed to doubt that tomorrow would bring something wonderful just around the next horizon. During one of these afternoons, as Luffy pestered Shanks with increasing desperation to let him join their crew, the mountain bandit Higuma arrived with his gang to assert dominance over what he considered his rightful territory. What followed was Luffy's first real lesson in the complex nature of strength and courage, a masterclass in the difference between power and wisdom that would shape his understanding of leadership for the rest of his life. He watched in confusion and growing anger as Higuma poured sake over Shanks's head, mocked him as a coward, destroyed property with casual cruelty, and left the bar in triumph while the red-haired captain simply cleaned up the mess with a smile that never wavered. To young Luffy, this seemed like the greatest betrayal imaginable, a fundamental violation of everything he thought he understood about strength and justice. How could someone he admired so completely allow himself to be humiliated without fighting back? How could a man who commanded respect across the Grand Line submit so meekly to a mere mountain bandit whose reputation barely extended beyond his own small corner of the East Blue? In his child's understanding of the world, strength was simple and straightforward. You protected what mattered to you. You stood up to bullies. You never backed down from a fight regardless of the odds or consequences. But it was the Gomu Gomu no Mi that would truly change everything, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than an oddly patterned snack sitting innocently in its chest. Luffy consumed it without thought or hesitation, as he did most things in those days, acting first on instinct and considering consequences only when they became unavoidable realities. The rubber powers that followed seemed almost like a joke at first, a curious party trick that let him stretch his limbs in amusing ways that delighted his friends and bemused the adults who witnessed his newfound elasticity. Only later would he understand the true magnitude of what he had traded away in that moment of thoughtless hunger. The sea, which had always seemed like the gateway to adventure and the highway to his dreams, became his greatest weakness and most persistent enemy. Water, which covered 7/10 of the world he dreamed of exploring, became a force that could drag him to the depths with casual indifference. In gaining the power to stretch beyond normal human limits, he had accepted limitations that would follow him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder that every gift came with a price that might not be apparent until it was too late to change course. Yet, even as Shanks explained what the devil fruit had cost him, cataloguing the ways in which this power would complicate every future adventure and create vulnerabilities that clever enemies could exploit, Luffy felt no regret whatsoever. To his young mind, every price was worth paying if it brought him closer to his dreams, every sacrifice acceptable if it opened new doors to possibility. The rubber powers were his now, part of him in ways that went beyond mere physical transformation, and he would learn to work with them rather than against them. The attack by Higuma's gang came without warning, as violence often does in a world where might makes right, and the strong prey upon the weak with casual indifference. Luffy found himself overwhelmed by men who saw his newfound powers as nothing more than an amusing novelty before they got down to the serious business of kidnapping and eventual murder. His rubber body, which had seemed so incredible just moments before, proved inadequate against the coordinated assault of experienced criminals, who understood that even the most unusual abilities had limits that could be exploited by those clever enough to find them. It was only when the true scope of his helplessness became clear, when the massive Sea King, Lord of the Coast, emerged from the depths with hunger in its ancient eyes and death written across its predatory features, that Shanks finally revealed the true nature of his strength. The conqueror's haki that he projected in that moment was beyond anything young Luffy had ever witnessed or could even begin to comprehend. Not the crude dominance that Higuma had displayed in the bar, not the simple application of physical force that settled most disputes in their small corner of the world, but something far more profound and terrifying. The intimidation that radiated from Shanks spoke to the deepest instincts of every living creature within its range, a presence that commanded respect not through threat of violence, but through the sheer overwhelming certainty of absolute power held in perfect control. The Sea King, a beast that had terrorized these waters for decades and devoured countless sailors who had dared to challenge its dominion, retreated without striking a single blow. Higuma's gang, men who had built their reputation on violence and intimidation, found themselves frozen by fear they could not even begin to understand or articulate. But victory came at a price that would haunt Luffy for years to come, and shape his understanding of responsibility in ways that no amount of training could have accomplished. Shanks's left arm, sacrificed to save a boy who had been too proud to listen to warnings about the dangers of the world, served as a permanent reminder of the cost of his recklessness. No amount of gratitude could undo what had been lost. No words of appreciation could restore what had been given up for his sake. No promise of future greatness could justify the price that had been paid. For the first time in his young life, Luffy understood that his actions had consequences that reached far beyond himself, that his choices could harm people he cared about in ways that could never be fully repaired. The weight of that knowledge settled upon his small shoulders like a cloak he would never be able to remove, a constant reminder that strength without wisdom was not just inadequate but actively dangerous to those who mattered most. The departure of the Red Hair Pirates marked the end of Luffy's childhood, in ways both obvious and subtle, the close of a chapter that had been defined by innocence and the opening of one that would be shaped by understanding. As their ship prepared to leave Fushia Village forever, carrying with them the dreams and adventures that had made life so vibrant for the past year, Shanks performed one final act that would shape the trajectory of an entire life and echo through history itself. The straw hat that he placed on Luffy's head was more than a simple gift or token of affection. It was a symbol of inherited dreams, a tangible connection to the freedom that called from beyond the horizon, a promise that someday the boy would grow into something worthy of the hopes placed in him. The hat carried with it the weight of Roger's legacy, though Luffy would not understand this connection for many years to come. It represented everything that pirates could be at their finest, not the crude bandits and murderers that most people imagined, but explorers and dreamers who refused to accept that the world was limited by other people's lack of imagination. The weight of that hat, both physical and symbolic, would become the foundation upon which Luffy built his understanding of responsibility, friendship, and the true meaning of strength. Shanks had shown him that real power was not about dominating others or proving superiority through violence. but about protecting what mattered most, even when it required personal sacrifice. The red-haired captain's willingness to endure humiliation, to sacrifice his arm, to place a child's safety above his own pride, demonstrated a kind of courage that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with love. In the years that followed, as Luffy grew from a small boy into a young man ready to chase his dreams across the vast oceans of the world, he would carry those lessons with him into every battle and through every trial. The straw hat became more than an accessory. It became a reminder of the promise he had made, the debt he owed, and the standard by which he would measure himself for the rest of his life. Every time he looked in a mirror, every time the wind caught the brim and lifted it from his head, he was reminded that he carried not just his own dreams, but the dreams of a man who had believed in him when he was nothing more than a reckless child with impossible ambitions. The boy who dreamed of freedom had learned his first great lesson about the price that freedom demanded from those brave enough to claim it. He had discovered that strength without wisdom was mere destruction, that courage without compassion was simple cruelty, and that the greatest adventures were not about what you could take from the world, but what you were willing to give to it in return. These truths would guide him through trials yet to come, through battles that would shake the world and losses that would break his heart, through moments of triumph and despair that would forge him into something far greater than even Shanks could have imagined when he placed that hat upon a small boy's head and charged him with carrying dreams too large for any single person to bear alone. The road to Mount Corvo stretched ahead like a sentence of exile, winding through forests that seemed to close in around the small boat, carrying 7-year-old Luffy toward a destiny he could never have imagined. Vice Admiral Garp sat at the helm with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he was solving two problems at once, finding proper supervision for his increasingly uncontrollable grandson, while simultaneously providing the mountain bandits with an additional source of revenue through the boy's care. The irony that he was delivering a future pirate to criminals was lost on him entirely, though perhaps it was fitting that Luffy's education in the realities of the world would come from those who lived outside its accepted boundaries. Curly Deiden received the news of her newest charge with all the enthusiasm of someone being asked to adopt a particularly destructive typhoon. The leader of the Dadan family bandits had built her reputation on a careful balance of criminal activity and self-preservation, avoiding the kind of attention that brought marine warships to her doorstep with their cannons loaded and their orders clear. The last thing she needed was the grandfather of a vice admiral dropping off his problem child like an unwanted package, complete with threats about what would happen if anything unfortunate befell the boy during his stay. But it was not Luffy who would prove to be Daiden's greatest challenge in the months to come. That honor belonged to the dark-haired child who already occupied the spare room in her mountain hideout, a boy whose very presence seemed to radiate a cold hostility that had nothing to do with the temperature of their elevated retreat. Portgas D. Ace possessed the kind of anger that burned without fuel, sustaining itself on grievances both real and imagined, feeding on a sense of injustice that seemed to encompass not just his own circumstances, but the very fact of his existence in a world that considered his birth a crime against nature. Their first meeting set the tone for months of conflict that would follow, establishing patterns of pursuit and rejection that would test Luffy's determination in ways that even Garp's brutal training had not managed to achieve. Luffy, with his characteristic inability to read social situations or accept that someone might genuinely not want his company, approached his new housemate with the same open friendliness he showed to everyone, chattering excitedly about his plans to become the Pirate King and inviting Ace to join him on adventures that existed only in his boundless imagination. Ace responded to this enthusiasm with the kind of calculated cruelty that children master when they feel powerless in every other aspect of their lives. his words designed to wound as deeply as possible while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. He understood instinctively that the quickest way to drive away this persistent annoyance was to attack the very dreams that seemed to sustain him, to demonstrate through mockery and dismissal that some ambitions were too foolish to deserve consideration from anyone with even basic common sense. The rejection stung more than Luffy was willing to admit, but not enough to deter him from his chosen course of action. Every morning, as Ace prepared for his mysterious daily expeditions away from the bandit hideout, Luffy would position himself to follow with the dedication of someone who had never learned that persistence could be unwelcome. Every morning, Ace would create increasingly elaborate obstacles designed to shake his persistent shadow, traps that grew more sophisticated and dangerous. As his frustration with Luffy's stubborn refusal to give up mounted beyond any reasonable limit, logs strategically placed across narrow paths to catch unwary feet, ropes rigged to swing from trees at precisely the right moment to knock an unwary pursuer off balance, even small avalanches of stones triggered by pressure plates hidden beneath seemingly innocent patches of ground. Each trap was a testament to Ace's intelligence and creativity, but also to his growing desperation to maintain the solitude that had become his only source of comfort in a world that had never shown him kindness. To Ace, these elaborate defenses represented a legitimate response to unwanted intrusion into routines that had nothing to do with the annoying child who had been forced into his life without his consent or consultation. He had established patterns and territories that provided structure in an existence otherwise defined by chaos and uncertainty, and Luffy's arrival threatened to disrupt the careful equilibrium he had spent months constructing through trial and painful error. To Luffy, however, the traps represented puzzles to be solved, challenges to be overcome, evidence that Ace was far more interesting than his cold exterior suggested, and therefore worth whatever effort it took to understand him. Where another child might have been discouraged by repeated failure and increasingly obvious hostility, Luffy found only motivation to try harder, to demonstrate through sheer persistence that his intentions were genuine and his friendship worth having. It took weeks of dogged pursuit, countless bruises from triggered traps, and a determination that bordered on the pathological, but eventually Luffy's stubborn refusal to accept defeat led him to the great secret that Ace had been so carefully guarding from the world. Grey Terminal sprawled before them like a monument to civilization's failures, a vast dumping ground where the refuse of Goa Kingdom accumulated in mountains of discarded dreams and broken promises. The smell alone was enough to turn most stomachs, the combined scent of rot and rust and human waste creating an atmosphere that seemed to physically repel intruders. Among the twisted metal and rotting wood, two children had built themselves a kingdom founded on the simple principle that what others threw away might still hold value to those willing to search for it with sufficient patience and creativity. The settlement they had established was crude but functional, a testament to human ingenuity applied to the problem of survival in circumstances that would have defeated most adults. Their shelter was constructed from materials that had been deemed worthless, yet it provided protection from the elements and privacy from prying eyes. The friendship between Ace and Sabo had been forged in the crucible of mutual necessity. Two boys from vastly different backgrounds, united by their shared rejection of the worlds that had shaped them in ways they could never accept. Ace carried the weight of parentage that felt like a curse, the knowledge that his very existence was considered an affront to everything the world claimed to hold sacred, that his father's crimes had marked him as guilty before he had committed any sins of his own. Sabo bore the burden of nobility that felt like a prison, trapped within expectations that demanded he sacrifice everything authentic about himself in service to maintaining appearances that served no purpose beyond perpetuating systems of oppression that he found morally repugnant. His family's wealth had been built on the suffering of others, their status maintained through the careful cultivation of ignorance about the conditions that made their comfort possible. In Grey Terminal, they had found freedom from these inherited constraints, the liberty to be exactly who they chose to be, without reference to family names or obligations that had been imposed upon them before they were old enough to understand their implications. They had established routines of scavenging and survival that provided not just the necessities of life, but the satisfaction of independence, the knowledge that they could take care of themselves without depending on adults whose love came with conditions they were unwilling to meet. The treasure they had accumulated through months of careful searching represented more than mere wealth. It was proof of their competence, evidence that they could thrive in circumstances that would have broken weaker spirits, a tangible symbol of their rejection of everything their respective backgrounds had tried to force them to become. Every coin had been earned through labor and cleverness, rather than inherited privilege or criminal brutality. Luffy's arrival in their carefully constructed sanctuary represented a threat to everything they had built together, his innocence dangerous in a place where cynicism provided armor against disappointment, his trust a liability where suspicion meant the difference between survival and destruction. His dreams seemed like luxuries they could not afford in a world that had already taught them the cost of hoping for too much, the pain that came from believing that better things were possible. The logical response was elimination, the removal of a problem before it could grow into something unmanageable. But logic had not accounted for Luffy's absolute inability to recognize when he was unwanted, or to understand that some people might not immediately appreciate his company. Even as Ace and Sabo discussed the practicalities of murder with the casual detachment of children planning a game, Luffy continued to chatter about his dreams and adventures, his unshakable conviction that they were destined to become the best of friends. The intervention of the Blue Jam pirates transformed what might have been a simple disposal of an inconvenient witness into something far more complex and morally challenging. Porkemi's interrogation revealed the first crack in the armor that Ace and Sabo had constructed around their hearts. The moment when their carefully maintained indifference encountered something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about human nature and the possibilities for genuine loyalty in a world that seemed designed to reward betrayal. Under torture that would have broken most adults, let alone a child barely old enough to understand the questions being asked of him, Luffy refused to reveal the location of the treasure that Ace and Sabo had stolen. Not because he particularly cared about money or understood the economic implications of their theft, but because he had somehow decided that these two boys were his friends, and friends did not betray each other regardless of the consequences such loyalty might bring. The beating that followed was systematic and brutal, designed not just to extract information, but to break the spirit of a child whose only crime had been following where curiosity led him into danger. He was too inexperienced to recognize. Porkemi applied pain with the methodical precision of someone who had learned through years of experience exactly how much damage a small body could absorb before crossing the line from persuasion into permanent harm or accidental death. Each blow was calculated to maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of killing their only source of information. A delicate balance that required both skill and restraint in equal measure. Still, Luffy refused to speak, even as consciousness faded and awareness narrowed to nothing beyond the immediate reality of pain and the distant echo of voices demanding answers he would not provide. His loyalty absolute, despite having known these boys for mere days. It was Ace who broke first, his carefully cultivated indifference crumbling in the face of witnessing innocence destroyed for his sake. the protective barriers he had built around his emotions proving inadequate when confronted with someone else's suffering that existed solely because of his own actions. The rescue that followed was less about strategy than about rage, the fury of someone discovering that his attempts to protect his small world had resulted in pain inflicted on someone who had never wished him anything but good. Sabo's participation in the rescue was driven by similar emotions, though his anger was tempered by the strategic thinking that had been trained into him through years of noble education applied to criminal enterprise. He understood both the tactical situation and the broader implications of what they were attempting, but in that moment, such calculations mattered less than the simple moral imperative to save someone who had suffered for their sake. The fight with Porkemi served as both catharsis and revelation, allowing Ace to channel months of accumulated anger into something constructive, while demonstrating to Sabo that their new companion possessed qualities that went far beyond mere persistence or annoying optimism. Luffy had endured torture rather than betray people who had shown him nothing but hostility, had maintained loyalty to boys who had plotted his death, had proven that trust could exist without conditions or guarantees of reciprocity. In the aftermath of violence, as they tended to wounds and processed what had transpired between them, something fundamental shifted in the dynamic that had defined their relationships. The barriers that had separated them began to dissolve, replaced by the recognition that they shared something more valuable than any treasure they might steal from the corrupt nobility of Goa Kingdom. They had found in each other the family that biology and circumstance had failed to Goa Kingdom provide. The adventures that followed took on a different character than the solitary expeditions Ace had previously undertaken, or the careful scavenging operations that he and Sabo had perfected through months of practice. Where once survival had been grim necessity, now there was joy in discovery, laughter in success, companionship in both triumph and failure. Luffy's enthusiasm proved infectious in ways they had not expected. His ability to find wonder in the mundane, transforming their necessary activities into games worthy of the pirates they all dreamed of becoming. Sabo's revelation about his true identity should have driven wedges between them according to every social convention they understood. The knowledge that one of their number belonged to the very class they had defined themselves in opposition to creating conflicts that seemed impossible to resolve. Noble blood carried implications that went far beyond mere social status, representing everything they had rejected about the world beyond their makeshift kingdom in Grey Terminal. Yet somehow the confession only served to strengthen their bond, proof that the circumstances of birth mattered less than the choices one made in response to those circumstances, that nobility could be rejected, just as poverty could be transcended through determination and mutual support. Sabo's willingness to abandon privilege in favor of genuine friendship demonstrated a kind of courage that had nothing to do with facing physical danger and everything to do with choosing authenticity over advantage. It was in this context of shared rejection of false authority that their dreams began to take concrete shape, moving beyond vague aspirations to specific plans for futures that suddenly seemed achievable rather than merely wishful. The idea of becoming pirates was not merely about adventure or treasure, but about creating lives that answered to no authority but their own conscience, that recognized no law but the bonds they chose to forge with others who shared their understanding of what freedom actually meant. They would sail beyond the horizon that limited their current world, would discover islands where freedom was not just a dream but a daily reality, would build a crew founded on loyalty rather than fear, and mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance. The ocean represented infinite possibility, a realm where past mistakes could be left behind, and future greatness achieved through dedication to ideals that transcended personal gain. The Sake ceremony that formalized their brotherhood carried weight that went far beyond childish play acting or temporary alliance. The ritual investment with meaning that transformed casual friendship into something approaching sacred obligation. In sharing the rice wine that symbolized their commitment to each other, they were creating bonds that they intended to honor, regardless of what the future might bring, promises that would endure, even if circumstances conspired to separate them across vast distances. Each brother brought different strengths to their newly formalized alliance, creating a combination of capabilities that was greater than the sum of its individual parts. Ace contributed the fierce intensity that came from having been forced to prove himself worthy of existence from his earliest memories, a determination that burned with the heat of righteous anger, channeled into constructive purpose rather than mere destruction for its own sake. Sabo offered the intelligence and strategic thinking that came from noble education combined with street experience, able to plan complex operations while understanding both the mindset of their enemies and the resources available to their small band. His knowledge of how the upper classes thought and operated provided crucial insights into weaknesses that could be exploited by those clever enough to recognize opportunities. Luffy provided something that neither of his brothers fully understood at the time, but which would prove to be the most valuable contribution of all: an absolute faith in the rightness of their cause and the inevitability of their ultimate success that bordered on the supernatural, where others might have been daunted by the magnitude of their dreams, where cynicism might have suggested that 3 children could never hope to challenge the established order of the world. Luffy maintained an optimism so complete that it became a source of strength for all of them. The months that followed were perhaps the happiest of their young lives, filled with increasingly ambitious adventures that served as both entertainment and training for the greater journeys that lay ahead in their uncertain but promising future. They learned to fight not just with fists but with weapons, not just as individuals but as a coordinated team capable of supporting each other in ways that multiplied their effectiveness beyond what simple arithmetic would suggest. They developed the skills of navigation and survival in hostile environments, of reading the intentions of others, and responding appropriately to both friendship and threat, of managing resources and planning operations that required both patience and decisive action. Each lesson was learned through practical application rather than theoretical study, their education grounded in reality rather than abstract principles. But happiness built on borrowed time carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And Sabo's noble heritage, which had seemed like nothing more than an unfortunate accident of birth, began to reassert itself as his family grew tired of his extended absence from the carefully scripted life they had planned for him. The wealth and status that he had rejected in favor of genuine companionship became weapons in the hands of those who valued control over contentment. The capture orchestrated by Sabo's father represented a betrayal of everything the 3 brothers had built together, a demonstration that the power of established authority could reach even into their carefully protected sanctuary when properly motivated and adequately funded. The Blue Jam pirates, whom they had previously encountered as enemies to be fought and defeated, became instruments of separation, their greed and lack of principle making them perfect tools for those who preferred manipulation to direct confrontation. The choice that Sabo faced was impossible by design, structured to ensure that no matter what decision he made, something precious would be lost, and suffering would be inflicted on people who deserved better. He could maintain his freedom and watch his brothers suffer the consequences of his family's wrath, knowing that their lives would be made miserable or ended entirely because of his refusal to cooperate, or he could surrender his autonomy in exchange for their safety, sacrificing his own dreams to preserve their ability to pursue theirs. It was the kind of moral trap that adults excelled at constructing when they wished to ensure compliance without appearing overtly tyrannical. a situation where every available option led to pain. And the only question was, who would bear the burden of suffering for others' benefit? The sophistication of the manipulation spoke to years of experience in breaking the spirits of those who dared to resist the established order. Sabo's return to noble society should have felt like victory to parents who had spent years trying to mold him into the shape they desired. But instead it marked the beginning of a different kind of tragedy, the slow death of a spirit that had tasted freedom and found everything else wanting by comparison. The clothes, the manners, the expectations, the carefully scheduled activities designed to prepare him for a life of inherited privilege. All of it felt like elaborate forms of torture designed to kill everything authentic about his identity. The fire that consumed Grey Terminal on the night of the Celestial Dragon's visit served multiple purposes for those who ordered its creation, each goal more callous and calculated than the last. It eliminated an eyesore that embarrassed the kingdom. When viewed by visiting nobility, it cleared land that might be developed for more profitable purposes, and it provided a dramatic demonstration of what happened to those who existed outside the accepted social order without proper protection. The fact that children might die in the flames was not a tragic side effect to be minimized, but part of the intended message, a reminder that the lives of the poor and dispossessed were worth less than the comfort of their betters. The world noble's sensibilities were more important than the continued existence of hundreds of human beings whose only crime was their inability to contribute meaningfully to the kingdom's prosperity. For Luffy and Ace, trapped within the inferno that had once been their kingdom of freedom, the fire represented their first real confrontation with mortality and the systematic cruelty of the world they would have to navigate as adults. The games they had played, the adventures they had shared, the dreams they had nurtured, all of it seemed suddenly fragile when confronted with the basic reality of burning wood and choking smoke that transformed their sanctuary into a death trap. They were forced to discover reserves of courage and determination they had not known they possessed, to fight for survival with everything they had learned during their months of preparation, while grappling with the knowledge that this destruction was deliberate rather than accidental. Someone had decided that their lives were expendable, that their dreams were worthless, that their very existence was an inconvenience to be eliminated through fire and systematic neglect. The rescue by the Daydan family bandits provided salvation from immediate death, but could not address the deeper wounds that the experience had carved into their souls, injuries that would never fully heal regardless of how much time passed or how much success they achieved. They had learned that the world was willing to sacrifice children to maintain the comfort of adults, that justice was nothing more than a word used to justify whatever those in power decided to do. The news of Sabo's death arrived like a final blow to dreams that were already staggering under the weight of harsh reality. The boy who had been their brother reduced to a casualty report in some official record of the violence that had accompanied the world noble's visit. His ship had been fired upon for the crime of existing in waters claimed by those who recognized no authority but their own whim. His life ended before he could even begin to chase the dreams they had shared in happier times. Luffy's grief was immediate and overwhelming, a display of raw emotion that his brothers had rarely seen from him during their time together. The boy who had maintained optimism through every setback reduced to uncontrollable sobbing that seemed to draw up pain from depths he had not known existed. For the first time since they had met him, his faith in the fundamental goodness of the world appeared to waver, challenged by evidence too stark to be dismissed or rationalized away. Ace's response was different but no less profound, his anger transforming from the diffuse resentment he had always carried into something focused and burning with laser intensity. The world that had killed Sabo was the same world that considered Ace's very existence an abomination, the same system that would hunt him for the crimes of a father he had never known, and the death of his brother crystallized everything he hated about the established order, while providing a focal point for rage that had previously lacked clear direction. The promise that Ace extracted from Luffy, that his brother would never die and leave him alone in a world that had already proven its willingness to destroy everything good, carried weight that went far beyond simple reassurance or childhood oath. It was an acknowledgement of how much they meant to each other, a recognition that the loss of Sabo had created wounds that might never fully heal, a commitment to face whatever dangers lay ahead together, rather than risk experiencing such devastating separation again. The 7 years that followed Sabo's apparent death were marked by intense preparation for the adventures that lay ahead, but also by a subtle shift in the dynamic between the surviving brothers that reflected their shared understanding of how fragile happiness could be. Where once their training had been motivated by excitement about future possibilities, now it carried undertones of grim determination, the recognition that the world would test them in ways far more severe than any games they might devise for themselves. They pushed each other harder than before, their sparring sessions taking on an edge that had not existed in their earlier, more playful conflicts, each brother understanding that failure to grow stronger might mean watching the other die, as they had been forced to watch Sabo disappear forever. The guilt they carried, that they had been unable to save him, that they had not even known he was in danger until it was too late, drove them to extremes of effort that sometimes bordered on self-destruction. Ace's departure at 17 marked both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of their shared childhood, and the commencement of the individual journeys that would eventually lead them both toward the destinies they had chosen in those long-ago days when 3 boys had sworn brotherhood over cups of stolen sake. The goodbye was complicated by their shared understanding that the next time they met, if they met again at all, would be as equals rather than as older and younger brother, each having proven himself worthy of the dreams they had once shared in simpler times. For Luffy, watching Ace's ship disappear beyond the horizon represented his first real confrontation with the loneliness that would become a recurring theme in his life, the recognition that achieving his dreams would require him to say goodbye to people he loved, and trust that the bonds between them were strong enough to survive any separation. The boy who had always been surrounded by family found himself truly alone for the first time, left with nothing but his memories and the promise he had made to follow in his brother's footsteps when his own time came. The village of Shimotsuki rested in the East Blue like a monument to discipline and tradition, its dojo standing proud against rolling hills where the sound of wooden swords clashing carried on every breeze. Here, among students who dreamed of greatness but lacked the fire to achieve it, a green-haired boy arrived with nothing but determination burning in his eyes, and the kind of stubborn pride that refused to acknowledge the possibility of permanent defeat. Roronoa Zoro had left behind whatever life he had known before, though he spoke little of those abandoned circumstances, declaring only that he intended to become invincible, and that everything else was merely distraction from that singular purpose. Even as a child, Zoro possessed a natural talent for swordsmanship that set him apart from his peers in ways that went beyond mere technical proficiency. His movements carried an intensity that made the other students uncomfortable, a focus so complete that it seemed to consume everything around him until nothing existed except the blade in his hand and the target he intended to strike. The adults who observed his training noted that he approached each session not as practice but as battle, every swing of his wooden sword carrying the weight of someone who understood that failure meant more than embarrassment or disappointment. Under Kushiro's patient instruction, Zoro learned the fundamental techniques that separated trained swordsmen from mere brawlers wielding sharp objects. But more importantly, he absorbed the philosophy that transformed combat from simple violence into something approaching art. The sensei spoke of swords as living things with their own personalities and wills, entities that required partnership rather than dominance, respect rather than mere utilization. These lessons would prove crucial in years to come, though at the time they seemed like abstract concepts that paled beside the immediate satisfaction of defeating opponents. Yet, for all his natural ability and dedicated training, there remained one opponent who consistently denied him victory, one challenge that refused to yield, regardless of how much effort he applied or how desperately he desired success. Kuina, Kushiro's daughter, possessed a combination of skill and intuition that made their sparring sessions exercises. In frustration for the ambitious boy, who had never encountered an obstacle he could not eventually overcome through sheer determination and relentless practice, their rivalry became the defining feature of Zoro's time at the dojo, each defeat serving not as discouragement but as fuel for the fire that burned within him with increasing intensity. He would spend hours after regular training sessions perfecting techniques that he hoped might give him the edge he needed, pushing his young body beyond reasonable limits in pursuit of the moment when he could finally claim victory over someone who seemed to embody everything he aspired to become but could never quite reach. The unofficial count of their matches grew with each passing month, 2,000 defeats accumulating like stones in Zoro's heart. Each loss, a reminder that talent alone was insufficient. When facing someone who possessed both natural ability and the kind of focused dedication that transformed potential into achievement, Kuina never gloated over her victories, never mocked his failures, but her consistent success spoke louder than words could have, a constant demonstration that his dream of invincibility remained frustratingly distant. It was during one of his solitary training sessions that Zoro encountered Shimotsuki Kozaburo, Kuina's grandfather and the legendary swordsmith, whose blades had gained fame throughout the East Blue for their exceptional quality and mysterious properties. The old man observed the boy's frantic efforts with eyes that had witnessed decades of ambitious students, most of whom had eventually abandoned their dreams. When faced with the harsh realities of what true mastery demanded from those who sought it, Kozaburo spoke of the mystical word Tsunachi, claiming it could summon strength from the deepest wells of the heart when properly invoked, though he warned that such power came only to those whose resolve was absolute and whose purpose was pure. Zoro listened with the skepticism of youth while simultaneously filing away every word, understanding instinctively that this old man possessed knowledge that went far beyond simple sword-making techniques or martial philosophy. The gift of real swords marked a turning point in Zoro's training, the weight of actual steel in his hands transforming his understanding of what it meant to wield a blade with lethal intent. Kozaburo explained that every sword possessed its own personality, its own will that had to be respected and understood, rather than simply dominated through force or technique alone. The relationship between swordsman and weapon was partnership, a bond that required mutual respect and understanding to achieve its full potential. The concept of cursed swords particularly fascinated Zoro, Kozaburo's explanation that such weapons were merely too strong-willed for weak wielders, resonating with his own understanding of strength as something that had to be claimed rather than granted. A truly powerful blade would reject those who lacked the conviction necessary to master it. But for someone with sufficient determination and respect for the weapon's nature, even the most notorious cursed sword could become a trusted ally in battle. These lessons would prove prophetic in years to come, though at the time, they seemed like interesting philosophy rather than practical guidance. Zoro absorbed every word while maintaining his focus on the immediate challenge that defined his existence at the dojo. Finding some way to defeat Kuina and prove that his dream of becoming the world's greatest swordsman was more than mere childish fantasy fueled by stubborn pride and ignorance of what such achievement actually required. The decision to challenge Kuina with real swords represented Zoro's last desperate attempt to find some advantage that might shift the balance of their rivalry in his favor. He reasoned that the added danger and weight of actual blades might reveal skills in himself that wooden practice swords could not awaken, or perhaps expose weaknesses in her technique that had remained hidden during their countless previous encounters with safer weapons. The duel that followed was perhaps the most important few minutes of Zoro's young life, though not for the reasons he had anticipated when he issued the challenge with such confidence. Kuina's victory came not just swiftly but decisively, her real blade dancing around his desperate attacks with the same ease she had always displayed, demonstrating that the gulf between their abilities was not a matter of equipment or circumstance, but fundamental differences in understanding and application of swordsmanship principles. The defeat was so complete, so utterly without hope or dignity, that it shattered something within Zoro's carefully constructed self-image. He had convinced himself that his 2,000 previous losses were merely preparation, steps on a path that would eventually lead to triumph if he could just find the right approach or circumstance. The realization that even with real swords, even with everything at stake, he remained helplessly outmatched, forced him to confront possibilities he had never seriously considered. But it was not the physical defeat that marked this duel as transformative. It was the conversation that followed, the moment when two children spoke honestly about dreams that seemed to contradict everything the world had taught them about what was possible for people like them. Zoro's tears came not from shame at losing, but from the overwhelming frustration of someone who had given everything he had to offer and found it insufficient to achieve what mattered most to him. His confession of his dream to become the world's greatest swordsman was the first time he had spoken those words aloud to another person. The articulation of an ambition so vast that it had previously existed only in the secret chambers of his heart. To give voice to such aspirations was to make them real in ways that private determination could never achieve, but it also exposed them to the judgment and potential ridicule of others who might find such dreams laughably unrealistic. Kuina's response revealed depths of understanding and shared ambition that Zoro had never suspected. Her own dream of swordsman supremacy, complicated by the biological and social constraints that the world imposed on female warriors. Her father's words about the inevitable limitations that her gender would place on her development had planted seeds of doubt that poisoned her victories with the fear that they were temporary achievements destined to be overwhelmed by male physical advantages as they both matured. The philosophical discussion that followed touched on fundamental questions about the nature of strength and the role that physical attributes played in determining ultimate success in combat. Kuina's acceptance that her current superiority would eventually be eroded by natural processes beyond her control represented a kind of despair that Zoro found incomprehensible. His own understanding of strength rooted in the belief that will and technique could overcome any disadvantage if applied with sufficient dedication. His angry response to her resignation stemmed not from disagreement with biological facts, but from fury at her willingness to surrender dreams that she was uniquely qualified to achieve. To Zoro, her current dominance was proof that gender-based limitations were not insurmountable obstacles, but challenges to be overcome through the same determination that had carried her to victory in every one of their encounters. Her acceptance of defeat before the battle had even been fought seemed like betrayal of everything their rivalry had represented. The promise they made that night transcended their individual ambitions to become something larger and more meaningful than either could have achieved alone. Their oath that one of them would become the world's greatest swordsman, regardless of whatever obstacles society or biology might place in their path, transformed their rivalry from competition into collaboration, each pushing the other toward heights that neither could have reached in isolation. The tragedy that followed would haunt Zoro for the rest of his life, though not because of its inherent sadness, but because of its sheer, inexplicable randomness. Queena's death by falling downstairs was so mundane, so utterly without dignity or meaning, that it seemed to mock everything they had shared together, and all the dreams they had sworn to pursue with unwavering dedication. That someone with her skill and awareness could be claimed by such an ordinary accident felt like cosmic injustice of the highest order. The discovery of her death the next morning left Zoro grappling with emotions. He had no framework for processing grief and anger and confusion, swirling together in ways that threatened to overwhelm his ability to function. The girl who had been his greatest challenge, his inspiration for improvement, his partner in dreams too large for their small village to contain, had been reduced to a lifeless body at the bottom of a staircase, her potential snuffed out by forces that had nothing to do with swordsmanship or ambition or any of the things that had defined her identity. His approach to Kushiro to request Queena's sword was perhaps the most difficult conversation of his young life. The articulation of intentions that felt simultaneously like honor and presumption. The Wado Ichimonji represented more than a weapon. It was a piece of Quina herself, a tangible connection to the dreams they had shared and the promise they had made under stars that had witnessed their oath to transcend every limitation the world might try to impose upon them. The sensei's decision to grant this request spoke to his understanding of what the sword meant to both his daughter's memory and Zoro's future, recognition that some bonds transcended death, and that the weapon would serve its highest purpose in the hands of someone who would carry forward the dreams it had been crafted to enable. The white-hilted blade would become Zoro's most treasured possession, a constant reminder of promises that death could not release him from keeping. The years that followed Queena's death saw Zoro transform from a talented but undisciplined student into something approaching the swordsman he had always claimed he would become. His training, taking on an intensity that bordered on obsession as he sought to honor her memory through achievement that would justify the faith she had placed in him. Every technique mastered, every opponent defeated, every step toward his ultimate goal was dedicated to the girl who would never see him fulfill the promise they had made together. His departure from Shimotsuki village was inevitable once he had learned everything the dojo could teach him, though leaving meant abandoning the last place where Queena's presence could still be felt in the familiar training grounds and well-worn practice areas where they had spent countless hours pushing each other toward excellence. The world beyond the village borders held the challenges he would need to overcome to become truly worthy of the dream they had shared. The name of Dracul Mihawk reached his ears like a clarion call, whispers of the current world's greatest swordsman, providing him with a concrete target for his ambitions, rather than the abstract goal he had previously pursued. Here was a man whose defeat would represent the ultimate validation of everything he had worked toward, the living embodiment of the summit he intended to climb, regardless of how many years or how much sacrifice the journey might require. His subsequent wandering through the East Blue was marked by increasingly desperate attempts to find his way to the Grand Line, where such legendary figures were said to reside, though his complete lack of navigational ability turned every journey into an exercise in frustration that tested his patience in ways that no opponent ever had. The irony that someone dedicated to such precise physical discipline could be so utterly helpless when it came to basic direction finding was not lost on him, though it did nothing to improve his situation. Survival during these wandering years required him to develop skills beyond swordsmanship, the harsh realities of life as a masterless warrior, forcing him to adapt to circumstances that the sheltered environment of the dojo had never prepared him for. Bounty hunting provided both income and combat experience, each captured criminal representing another step in his development, while bringing him closer to the resources he would need to eventually reach the Grand Line and the challenges that awaited him there. The encounters with Johnny and Yosaku provided him with his first real companions since leaving the village, though their relationship was built more on mutual convenience than the deep bonds he had shared with Quina. These fellow bounty hunters offered practical knowledge about survival in a world where strength alone was insufficient to guarantee success, teaching him lessons about resources and reputation that complemented his martial training in ways he had not anticipated. The offer from Baroque Works represented a tempting shortcut to the kind of resources and connections that could accelerate his journey toward the Grand Line, but Zoro's response revealed character traits that would define his approach to every future decision. His demand to lead the organization rather than serve within it spoke to pride that refused to accept subordinate positions. But more importantly, it demonstrated his unwillingness to compromise his independence for the sake of convenience. The killing of Mr. Seven in self-defense marked his first lethal encounter with agents of the shadowy organization, establishing a pattern of violent resolution that would follow him throughout his career, while demonstrating that his principles came with consequences that extended beyond personal cost to affect others who chose to oppose him. The incident also served notice to the criminal underworld that this particular bounty hunter was not someone to be trifled with or recruited through conventional means. His final capture at Shellstown was the result of moral choice rather than tactical failure. His decision to kill Helmeppo's wolf, representing the kind of intervention on behalf of the innocent that revealed the true nature of his character, beneath the cold exterior he presented to the world. That he was willing to accept punishment for this action rather than flee, demonstrated both honor and the kind of stubborn pride that made him simultaneously admirable and exasperating. The month he spent tied to the execution post was perhaps the most psychologically challenging period of his life since Quina's death. The forced inactivity and public humiliation testing his resolve in ways that no physical opponent ever could. Yet he endured without complaint or plea for mercy, his silence speaking louder than words about his determination to see through any commitment he made, regardless of the personal cost involved. The promise he had made to the girl whose life he had saved was binding in ways that went beyond legal obligation, representing the kind of moral debt that could only be repaid through actions that honored the spirit rather than merely the letter of the agreement. That such honor would eventually lead to his recruitment by a rubber-powered captain who shared his uncompromising approach to protecting the innocent was perhaps inevitable, though neither could have predicted the partnership that would develop from such unlikely beginnings. As he waited in that dusty courtyard for either rescue or execution, Zoro carried within himself not just the technical skills that made him formidable in combat, but the philosophical framework that would guide every future decision he made. Quina's memory lived on not just in the sword he carried, but in the unwavering commitment to excellence that refused to accept anything less than the absolute pinnacle of achievement, no matter how long the journey might take or what sacrifices it might require along the way. The island of Syrup Village rested in the east blue like a painting of pastoral tranquility, its rolling hills dotted with vineyards and olive groves that spoke to generations of peaceful cultivation, undisturbed by the violent currents that swept through other parts of the world. Here, among people who measured their lives in seasons and harvests rather than adventures and conquests, a boy grew up whose greatest talent lay not in any practical skill, but in the elaborate construction of stories that transformed mundane reality into something worthy of legend and song. Usopp's birth had been marked by absence rather than celebration. His father, Yasop, having departed on the day of his son's arrival to join the crew of a red-haired captain whose dreams of adventure proved more compelling than the responsibilities of parenthood. The timing was cruel in its perfection, leaving a newborn child and exhausted mother to face the world alone, while the man who should have protected them sailed toward horizons that promised excitement, but delivered only separation and eventual heartbreak. His mother, Banchina, never spoke bitterly of the husband who had abandoned them for the sake of pursuing dreams that required him to forsake everything domestic and settled. Instead, she filled their small house with stories of Yasop's marksmanship, tales of impossible shots and legendary accuracy that painted the absent father as a hero worthy of the sacrifice his family had made for his ambitions. These stories became the foundation upon which young Usopp built his understanding of what it meant to be brave, though the courage they described existed only in narrative rather than lived experience. From his earliest memories, Usopp understood that reality was insufficient to contain the possibilities that his imagination could conceive, that the truth was often less interesting than the stories that could be constructed around it with sufficient creativity and dramatic flair. His lies began as innocent elaborations, small exaggerations that made ordinary events seem more significant, but gradually evolved into complex fabrications that created entire fictional histories for himself and his quiet village. The daily ritual that defined his childhood began each morning as he ran through the streets of Syrup Village, his young voice carrying across the peaceful settlement with urgent warnings that pirates were approaching their shores. The villagers' responses ranged from annoyed resignation to active pursuit, their frustration with his disruption of their routines, genuine but tempered by the understanding that he was merely a lonely child, seeking attention in the only way he knew how to command it. Yet beneath the surface irritation lay something approaching affection, the recognition that Usopp's daily performances had become part of the rhythm of their lives, in ways they had not consciously acknowledged until they became routine. His lies brought energy and excitement to a community that might otherwise have grown complacent in its security, reminding them daily that the wider world contained dangers and wonders that their peaceful existence had temporarily held at bay. The true motivation behind his compulsive storytelling revealed itself in the quiet moments he spent at his mother's bedside, watching illness slowly consume the only person who had ever loved him without condition or reservation. Banchina's strength ebbed with each passing day, her body surrendering to a disease that no amount of hope or determination could overcome, leaving her son desperate to find some way to preserve her spirits during the long, dark hours when pain became her primary companion. His stories of approaching pirates, of adventures and excitement just beyond the village's borders, were not merely attempts to gain attention, but desperate efforts to maintain his mother's connection to the dreams that had once filled their house with laughter and possibility. Each tale of danger and rescue, each fabricated account of heroic intervention, was offered as a gift to someone whose world had shrunk to the confines of a sick room, and the gradual recognition that her time was drawing to its inevitable close. The belief that his father might return, that Yasop's ship might appear on the horizon to bring healing and hope to their failing family, sustained both mother and son through months of increasing desperation and diminishing prospects. Usopp's cries that pirates were coming carried within them the whispered prayer that one of those ships might carry the man whose absence had defined their lives, whose legendary skills might somehow translate into the power to overcome obstacles that ordinary people could not hope to defeat. But hope, no matter how pure or desperately maintained, proved insufficient to halt the progress of disease that operated according to natural laws rather than narrative necessity. Banchina's death came not with dramatic final words or peaceful acceptance, but with the quiet cessation of breathing that marked the end of stories that would never be completed, dreams that would never find fulfillment in the waking world. The funeral that followed was attended by villagers who had grown fond of the gentle woman despite never truly knowing her story. Their sympathy, genuine but limited by their inability to comprehend the depth of loss that her death represented to a boy whose entire world had consisted of two people, one of whom had never been present and the other of whom would never return. The grave they dug became the repository for more than just her body. It held the last connection Usopp had to unconditional love and acceptance. His continuation of the daily pirate warnings after his mother's death transformed what had been attention-seeking behavior into something approaching memorial service, each cry carrying within it the echo of stories told to a dying woman who had needed to believe that excitement and adventure still existed somewhere beyond her suffering. The villagers who chased him or threw objects in his direction became unwilling participants in a ritual they did not understand but somehow respected despite their conscious irritation. The years that followed his mother's death were marked by increasing isolation despite his daily interactions with the community that had reluctantly adopted him as their shared responsibility. Usopp learned to fend for himself in practical matters, while his emotional development remained stunted by the absence of anyone who cared enough to guide him through the complex process of growing from boy to man. His lies became more elaborate and fantastic as his need for human connection grew more desperate, and his methods for achieving it more sophisticated. The formation of the Usopp Pirates represented his first successful attempt to create the family that death and abandonment had stolen from him, though his followers were children too young to fully understand the difference between imagination and reality. In teaching them to play at adventure and heroism, he began to develop the leadership skills that would eventually serve him well in genuine crises, though at the time these abilities seemed like nothing more than enhanced capacity for elaborate games and storytelling. The stories he told his young crew members were increasingly influenced by the tales his mother had shared about his absent father, legends of marksmanship and courage that painted Yasopp as the ideal pirate rather than the man who had abandoned his family for the sake of personal dreams. These second-hand accounts of heroism became the template for Usopp's own aspirations, the blueprint for the kind of person he hoped to become if he could ever find sufficient courage to move beyond mere storytelling into actual adventure. His relationship with Kaya began as an extension of the caretaking role he had played for his dying mother, though he was not consciously aware of the parallels until much later in their friendship. The wealthy girl's illness and isolation made her a perfect audience for his increasingly elaborate tales, her genuine appreciation for his stories providing the kind of positive reinforcement that he had not received since his mother's death. The mansion where Kaya lived in pampered but lonely confinement became Usopp's second stage, the grand rooms and manicured gardens providing an appropriately dramatic backdrop for adventures that grew more spectacular with each telling. Her laughter and engaged questions encouraged him to push the boundaries of plausibility ever further, creating narratives so complex and detailed that they began to take on lives of their own within his imagination. Yet even as he spun tales of impossible exploits and legendary encounters, Usopp remained painfully aware that his own life contained none of the courage or adventure that filled his stories. The disconnect between the hero he portrayed in his narratives and the frightened boy who created them became a source of private shame that he carefully concealed behind increasingly confident public performances. His fear of genuine danger was not cowardice in the traditional sense, but rather the natural response of someone who understood that real adventure carried consequences that stories could never adequately convey. The death of his mother had taught him that the world was cruel to those who lacked the power to protect themselves, that vulnerability was often punished rather than rewarded, and that safety lay in avoiding the kind of situations that made for exciting narratives but dangerous reality. The weapons he crafted for himself were more therapeutic than practical, slingshots and projectiles that allowed him to feel capable of defense without requiring him to face the kind of close-quarters combat that his nightmares suggested would expose his fundamental inadequacy as a warrior. His marksmanship skills, developed through countless hours of solitary practice, represented his attempt to honor his father's legendary abilities while maintaining the distance from danger that his fearful nature demanded. The 3 Usopp pirates who followed him with such devoted enthusiasm served as both inspiration and burden, their absolute faith in his fabricated heroism, creating pressure to live up to standards he had never actually achieved. Their willingness to believe his most outrageous claims made him simultaneously proud and guilty, honored by their trust, while terrified by the possibility that circumstances might eventually require him to prove worthy of their admiration. The daily routine of warning the village about approaching pirates had evolved over the years from simple attention-seeking to complex performance art, his calls becoming more theatrical and his timing more precisely calculated to achieve maximum impact, while minimizing actual inconvenience to the people who had grown to depend on his disruptions as markers of their otherwise routine days. The irony that his false warnings might someday prevent the villagers from recognizing genuine danger was not lost on him, though he convinced himself that such concerns were merely another excuse for cowardice masquerading as practical consideration. The boy who cried wolf understood the moral of the tale better than most, but his need for human connection remained stronger than his fear of eventual consequences. His secret visits to his mother's grave provided the only moments when he could drop his facade of confident heroism and acknowledge the fear and loneliness that drove his compulsive storytelling. These conversations with someone who could no longer respond were perhaps the most honest interactions of his life, confessions of inadequacy and desperate wishes for courage that he dared not voice to any living person who might judge him for his weakness. The dreams he shared with his absent father through stories told to empty air were simultaneously tribute and accusation, acknowledgement of legendary skills he hoped to inherit, balanced against resentment for abandonment that had shaped his entire existence. Yasopp's reputation as the finest marksman in the East Blue became both inspiration and impossible standard, something to aspire toward, while serving as constant reminder of his own limitations. The promise he made to his mother's headstone, that he would someday become the kind of brave warrior she had always believed him to be, was perhaps the most important oath of his life, though it would take years and genuine adventures beyond his imagination to understand what such courage actually required. The boy who had built his identity around elaborate lies would eventually discover that true bravery often involved nothing more complex than refusing to run when people you cared about needed protection. As he grew from child to young man within the confines of his peaceful village, Usopp developed skills and knowledge that would eventually prove invaluable in ways he could never have predicted. His constant storytelling, building vocabulary and creativity, while his leadership of younger children taught him lessons about responsibility and sacrifice that theoretical education could never have provided. The foundation was being laid for greatness he did not yet recognize within himself. The mechanical aptitude he demonstrated in creating weapons and gadgets for his games with the Usopp pirates revealed natural talents that complemented his marksmanship abilities, practical skills that would eventually allow him to contribute meaningfully to adventures that required more than mere courage to survive successfully. His fear of direct confrontation led him to develop indirect methods of combat that would prove surprisingly effective against opponents who expected conventional approaches. The village that had reluctantly tolerated his daily disruptions had actually grown dependent on his presence in ways they did not consciously acknowledge. His energy and imagination providing elements of excitement and unpredictability that their otherwise orderly lives lacked. The boy they chased away each morning had become an integral part of their community's identity, his stories and warnings part of the rhythm that defined their shared existence. When the time finally came for him to leave Syrup Village behind and pursue the adventures he had spent years describing in fictional form, Usopp would discover that the courage he had always claimed to possess had been growing within him all along, nurtured by years of taking care of others and accepting responsibility for their happiness and safety. The lies that had defined his childhood would prove to have been prophecies rather than mere fantasies, predictions of the hero he would become when circumstances finally demanded that he live up to the stories he had spent his lifetime perfecting. The kingdom of Germa floated through the North Blue, like a testament to scientific ambition, unchecked by moral restraint, its technological marvels, powered by the systematic elimination of human compassion in favor of calculated efficiency. Within the sterile halls of this mobile nation, Judge Vinsmoke pursued his vision of genetic perfection with the dedication of someone who had never questioned whether the power to reshape life carried responsibilities that transcended personal ambition or national glory. The birth of his 4 sons represented the culmination of years spent manipulating the fundamental building blocks of existence. Each child crafted according to specifications designed to create soldiers who would feel no fear, know no hesitation, and experience no weakness that might compromise their effectiveness in battle. The genetic modifications applied before their birth were intended to strip away everything that made them human in favor of capabilities that would make them perfect instruments of warfare and conquest. Yet even the most carefully calculated scientific endeavors could not account for the variables introduced by maternal love and desperate sacrifice, forces that operated according to principles that no laboratory could replicate or control. Sora's decision to counteract her husband's experiments through self-administered drugs represented the kind of moral courage that Judge's worldview had no framework for understanding, the choice to preserve her children's humanity, even at the cost of her own life and health. Sanji emerged from this biological battlefield as the sole survivor of his mother's intervention, his emotional capacity intact while his brothers developed into the emotionless killing machines their father had envisioned. The irony that this apparent failure of the genetic modification process would eventually prove to be its greatest success was lost on Judge, who saw only weakness where others might have recognized the preservation of everything that made life worth protecting. The early years of Sanji's childhood were defined by the growing recognition that he was fundamentally different from his siblings in ways that went beyond mere physical capability. Where Ichiji, Niji, and Yonji approached combat training with mechanical precision and complete emotional detachment, Sanji's responses were colored by empathy and fear, natural human reactions that his father viewed as contamination to be eliminated, rather than qualities to be cherished and protected. Sora's influence on her youngest son extended far beyond the biological intervention that had preserved his capacity for feeling. Her gentle lessons about compassion and kindness, delivered during stolen moments when Judge's attention was focused elsewhere, provided Sanji with a moral framework that would guide his decisions throughout his life. Most importantly, she introduced him to the transformative power of food prepared with love, the way that cooking could express emotions that words were inadequate to convey. The kitchen became their sanctuary, a place where mother and son could create beauty together while the rest of the kingdom pursued efficiency through the systematic elimination of everything soft and warm and human. Sanji's first attempts at cooking were clumsy and often disastrous, but Sora's patient encouragement and genuine appreciation for his efforts taught him that the intention behind the meal mattered more than technical perfection or aesthetic presentation. The dish he prepared for his ailing mother represented his first real act of love translated into tangible form, hours of careful work destroyed by his nervous stumbling as he carried it to her bedside. The ruined meal should have been a source of disappointment and shame, but Sora's response transformed failure into triumph through the simple act of consuming every bite with expressions of genuine delight and gratitude that came from her heart rather than mere politeness. Her declaration that his cooking was delicious, despite the obvious evidence to the contrary, became the foundation stone upon which Sanji built his understanding of what food could accomplish when prepared with proper motivation. The meal itself had been objectively terrible, but the love that had gone into its creation made it precious in ways that technical skill alone could never achieve. This lesson would resonate through every dish he prepared for the rest of his life. Judge's reaction to his son's culinary interests was predictably harsh, viewing such domestic pursuits as evidence of weakness that needed to be eliminated through more rigorous training and stricter discipline. The idea that a Vinsmoke prince might waste time and energy on activities that contributed nothing to military effectiveness or political power struck him as aberration that threatened the carefully constructed identity he had planned for, his genetic experiments. The training sessions that followed became exercises in systematic humiliation, Judge's attempts to force his youngest son into the mold that had successfully shaped his brothers, meeting with stubborn resistance born not from defiance but from fundamental incompatibility. Sanji's body, unmodified by the genetic enhancements that gave his siblings their superhuman capabilities, proved inadequate to meet the physical demands that his father considered basic requirements for Vinsmoke heritage. His brother's treatment of him during these sessions revealed the true horror of Judge's success with their genetic modification, their complete inability to feel empathy or compassion, allowing them to inflict cruelty that normal children would have found psychologically impossible. They viewed Sanji's weakness not as something to be pitied or protected, but as entertainment to be exploited, his pain providing them with amusement that they felt no guilt about pursuing. The bullying escalated with each passing day. Ichiji, Niji, and Yonji, discovering new ways to demonstrate their superiority, while their father looked on with approval rather than concern. Judge saw their treatment of Sanji as evidence that his genetic modifications had been successful, proof that they had transcended the kind of sentimental weakness that might make them hesitate when efficiency demanded ruthless action against enemies or obstacles. Only Reiju showed any kindness toward her youngest brother, though even her compassion was limited by the modifications that had altered her emotional capacity in subtle but significant ways. Her secret ministrations to his wounds after particularly brutal training sessions were perhaps the only moments of genuine human connection that Sanji experienced during his time in the kingdom. Brief interludes of care that helped sustain his faith that not everyone in his family had completely surrendered their humanity. The discovery of information about the All Blue during his confinement represented a turning point in Sanji's understanding of what his future might hold if he could escape the constraints of his birth and family expectations. The legendary sea where all the world's fish were said to gather captured his imagination in ways that military conquest and political power never could, offering him dreams that were worthy of the sacrifices that achieving them would require. Judge's decision to stage his son's funeral and imprison him in the dungeon marked the final abandonment of any pretense that familial bonds might be stronger than genetic programming or political necessity. The false death ceremony was intended to spare the family embarrassment while allowing the father to eliminate a source of disappointment without the complications that outright murder might have created with certain allies or observers. The iron mask that covered Sanji's face during his imprisonment was more than mere restraint. It was symbol of his father's shame and his own supposed unworthiness to bear the Vinsmoke name in public. The dungeon that became his world was designed not just to contain his body but to break his spirit, to convince him that the love and dreams his mother had nurtured within him were delusions that deserved to be crushed by the weight of reality. 6 months of isolation and darkness would have broken most children, but Sanji's time in confinement was sustained by the memories his mother had given him and the dreams of freedom that the All Blue represented. The book that described that legendary convergence of seas became his most treasured possession, proof that wonders existed beyond the sterile efficiency of Germa's technological marvels, places where beauty and abundance could flourish without being subordinated to military objectives. The crossing of the red line that brought Germa into the East Blue provided Sanji with his first opportunity for escape, though it came through Reiju's assistance rather than his own planning or capability. His sister's decision to help him flee represented her own quiet rebellion against the system that had shaped them all, her recognition that preserving some remnant of their family's humanity was worth the risk of their father's displeasure. The confrontation with Judge during his escape revealed the depths of mutual disappointment that had come to define their relationship, father and son recognizing that they were fundamentally incompatible in ways that could never be reconciled through compromise or understanding. The agreement that Sanji would renounce his royal heritage in exchange for freedom was perhaps the only decision they would ever make that served both their interests equally well. His time aboard the passenger ship Orbit provided his first taste of life outside the artificial constraints of Germa's military culture, though his understanding of normal human interaction remained limited by years of isolation and systematic dehumanization. The civilian crew who taught him the basics of cooking were probably unaware that they were nurturing talents that would eventually make him one of the finest chefs in the world, their casual instruction providing foundation for skills that would sustain him through trials yet to come. 2 years of relative peace and gradual healing came to an abrupt end when the ship was attacked by pirates whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by their greed and disregard for human life. Redleg Zeph's assault on the Orbit should have ended Sanji's life before his real adventures could begin, but his desperate declaration that he could not die because he needed to find the All Blue somehow reached something within the legendary pirate that conventional pleading could never have touched. The storm that separated attacker from victim while threatening to destroy both ships created the circumstances that would forge one of the most important relationships in Sanji's life, though neither he nor Zeph could have predicted the bond that would develop from such violent beginnings. The waves that smashed both vessels and left survivors stranded on a barren rock created a situation where past enmities became irrelevant compared to the immediate challenges of survival. The island that became their prison was perhaps the most hostile environment imaginable for sustaining human life. A jagged stone thrust from the ocean without vegetation, fresh water, or any of the resources that might have made long-term survival possible. The bags of food that represented their only sustenance were pitifully inadequate for supporting 2 people for any extended period, creating mathematical certainty that death was merely a matter of time unless rescue arrived quickly. Zeph's decision to give the smaller bag to Sanji while keeping the larger one for himself seemed like reasonable resource allocation based on body size and nutritional requirements, but it established a dynamic that would prove far more complex and psychologically devastating than either of them initially understood. The isolation imposed upon them by their positioning on opposite sides of the island was intended to preserve their sanity by limiting the social tensions that desperation might create, but it also prevented them from truly understanding each other's situation. Sanji's careful rationing of his meager supplies reflected both practical wisdom and the kind of optimism that refused to accept defeat, even when mathematical reality suggested that hope was merely prolonged suffering. His belief that 20 days might be stretched to 25 through careful management demonstrated the same determination that had sustained him through months of imprisonment and systematic abuse in his father's kingdom. The ships that passed during those early days of their isolation represented tantalizing glimpses of salvation that remained perpetually beyond reach. Each missed opportunity for rescue, adding weight to the growing certainty that they had been forgotten by a world that had more pressing concerns than two castaways on a remote rock. Sanji's frantic attempts to signal passing vessels gradually gave way to resigned acceptance that survival would depend entirely on their own resources and endurance. The physical deterioration that marked the progression of their isolation was perhaps less traumatic than the psychological pressure created by the constant awareness of approaching death. Each day of continued existence purchased at the cost of resources that brought them closer to the inevitable moment when their supplies would be exhausted and biological necessity would take precedence over civilized behavior. By the 50th day, Sanji had been reduced to the kind of skeletal condition that made every movement an exercise in willpower, overcoming physical limitation, his body consuming itself to maintain the basic functions necessary for continued consciousness. The hallucinations and memories that filled his increasingly frequent periods of delirium were dominated by thoughts of food he had wasted during his privileged childhood, abundance that had been taken for granted until scarcity made every crumb precious beyond measure. The decision to approach Zeph on the 70th day represented Sanji's final surrender to the kind of desperation that made previously unthinkable actions seem not just reasonable, but necessary for survival. The plan to kill the old pirate and steal whatever food remained in his possession was born not from malice, but from the basic biological imperative that transcended moral consideration when death became the only alternative to violence. The discovery that Zeph's bag contained treasure rather than food shattered every assumption that Sanji had made about their situation, revealing that the old pirate had been enduring starvation far more severe than anything his younger companion had experienced. The wealth that filled the bag represented power and possibility in civilized society, but on their barren rock it was worthless compared to even a single piece of moldy bread. The revelation that Zeph had consumed his own leg rather than touch the food that had been allocated to someone else transcended every understanding of sacrifice that Sanji had previously encountered, demonstrating a level of selfless devotion that his father's kingdom had no framework for comprehending or valuing. The crude surgery that had been performed without anesthetic or proper tools spoke to determination that operated according to principles higher than self-preservation. The explanation that such sacrifice had been motivated by their shared dream of finding the All Blue provided Sanji with his first encounter with someone whose vision of that legendary sea matched his own in both scope and intensity, proof that the dreams his mother had helped nurture were not mere childish fantasy, but aspirations worthy of any price their achievement might demand. Zeph's stories of the Grand Line and its wonders filled their remaining days with purpose that transcended mere survival, visions of a restaurant that could serve travelers from across the world, providing both men with goals that made continued existence meaningful, despite the uncertainty of whether rescue would arrive before their endurance failed completely. The promise Sanji made to help establish such a restaurant represented more than gratitude for the old pirate's sacrifice. It was recognition of debt that could never be fully repaid, but might be honored through dedicated service to ideals that both men had discovered were worth more than life itself. The 15 additional days they spent awaiting rescue were sustained by plans and dreams that transformed their ordeal from meaningless suffering into preparation for achievements yet to come. The rescue that finally arrived found two men whose relationship had been fundamentally altered by shared suffering and mutual sacrifice. Their bond forged not through blood or formal agreement, but through the kind of extreme circumstances that revealed character in ways that ordinary interactions never could. The floating restaurant they would eventually build together would serve as monument not just to their survival, but to the dreams that had made such survival meaningful. Barati rose from the waters of the East Blue as testament to the transformative power of cooking guided by love rather than mere technical skill. Its floating platform providing sanctuary for travelers who understood that some hungers could only be satisfied by food prepared with genuine care for those who would consume it. Under Zeph's harsh but loving tutelage, Sanji developed abilities that honored both his mother's early lessons and the debt he owed to the man who had sacrificed everything to preserve his life and dreams. The Oikote kingdom burned under skies that wept ash and smoke, its streets running red with the blood of innocents caught in a war that had consumed everything they had once called home. Among the ruins of what had been a thriving nation, 2 orphaned infants lay abandoned in the rubble, their cries lost amid the greater symphony of destruction that marked the end of their world. The elder sister, barely old enough to understand that the motionless forms around them would never wake again, clutched the baby to her chest with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had learned in a single terrible day that love was the only treasure that could not be stolen by violence. Nojiko's discovery of the orange-haired infant who would become her sister was perhaps the last act of kindness that the dying kingdom would witness, a moment of pure compassion amid circumstances that might have justified abandoning hope along with everything else that had been lost to the flames of war. The older child's decision to share her meager scraps of food with someone even more helpless than herself demonstrated the kind of instinctive generosity that no amount of tragedy could completely extinguish from the human heart. The Marine who found them days later was herself barely clinging to life, her body broken by wounds that spoke to battles fought with desperate courage against impossible odds. Belmir's uniform marked her as representative of the organization that should have protected civilians from the horrors that had consumed their homeland, though the devastation surrounding them suggested that even the world government's military might have proven inadequate against whatever forces had orchestrated such complete destruction. Her decision to use her remaining strength to carry 2 orphan children to safety, rather than seeking medical attention for injuries that threatened her own survival, revealed character that transcended duty or training. The journey to Kokoyashi village tested every reserve of endurance she possessed. Each step, a choice between personal survival and the welfare of innocents who had no one else to depend on her protection and care. The village doctor's initial assessment suggested that treating all 3 patients might be beyond his capabilities, the Marine's wounds so severe that saving her life would require resources and attention that might doom the children she had rescued. Belmir's insistence that the girls receive priority care, even if it meant sacrificing her own chances of survival, established the pattern of selfless devotion that would define her relationship with her adopted daughters for the rest of her life. The recovery that followed was long and painful, Belmir's body healing slowly while her heart attached itself to the children she had saved with increasing intensity. Nami and Nojiko represented more than mere rescue mission accomplished. They became the family she had never expected to have, sources of purpose and joy that transformed her existence from mere survival into something approaching genuine happiness despite the modest circumstances they shared. The poverty that defined their early years together was real and persistent, the limited resources available to a disabled former Marine insufficient to provide the kind of comfortable upbringing that wealthier families might have taken for granted. Yet somehow Belmir managed to create an atmosphere of abundance through the sheer force of her love, transforming scarcity into adventure, and making their small house feel like a palace through the warmth of genuine affection and acceptance. Her habit of skipping meals so that her daughters could eat their fill was carefully concealed behind elaborate excuses about adult dieting or lack of appetite, lies motivated by love rather than deception. The sacrifices she made were invisible to the children who benefited from them, her skilled manipulation of household resources creating the illusion of plenty while she herself grew thinner with each passing month. The clothes she refashioned from Nojiko's outgrown garments into new outfits for Nami represented hours of careful needlework performed during late-night vigils when the girls were safely asleep, her inexperienced hands learning techniques that necessity demanded she master. Each altered dress or repaired tear was an expression of devotion that transcended mere practicality. Love made tangible through patient labor that no one would ever fully appreciate or acknowledge. Nami's early fascination with maps and navigation revealed itself through her frequent theft of books and charts from the village shops, her desperate hunger for knowledge about the wider world manifesting in criminal behavior that worried her adoptive mother, even as it demonstrated intellectual capabilities that deserved better cultivation than their circumstances. Aloud, the stolen materials accumulated in her room like treasures, each pilfered chart representing dreams of adventure and understanding that their limited resources made seem impossibly distant. Genzo's role as unofficial village lawkeeper put him in the awkward position of repeatedly apprehending a child whose crimes were motivated by curiosity rather than malice. His duty to maintain order, conflicting with his growing affection for Belmere and sympathy for her daughter's situation. His clumsy attempts to balance justice with compassion often resulted in encounters that were more comedy than law enforcement, particularly when Belmere's flirtatious responses to his official scoldings left him too flustered to maintain proper authority. These interactions taught Nami valuable lessons about the power that feminine charm could wield over well-meaning men, knowledge that she would eventually weaponize with devastating effectiveness during her career as a thief and navigator. The innocent manipulation she observed between her adoptive mother and the village policeman provided her with techniques that would prove invaluable in situations where direct confrontation would have been suicidal. The tensions that inevitably arose from their impoverished circumstances came to a head during one of Nami's adolescent outbursts, her frustration with hand-me-down clothes and skipped meals finally overwhelming the gratitude and love that normally characterized their family dynamic. The cruel words she spoke about their lack of biological connection were motivated by guilt rather than genuine belief, her recognition that she was making Belamir's life more difficult, creating anger that she directed at the woman who had sacrificed everything to provide her with a home. Her declaration that she would have preferred to be adopted by a wealthy family struck Belamir like a physical blow, the ungrateful sentiment denying the years of love and sacrifice that had been freely given without expectation of reward or recognition. The immediate regret that followed this outburst was visible on Nami's face, even as the words continued to echo in the sudden silence that fell between them. Both mother and daughter recognizing that some things, once spoken, could never be completely forgotten or forgiven. The fight to Genzo's house provided Nami with temporary refuge from the shame of her own cruelty, though his gentle explanation of how Belamir had found and rescued her daughters only deepened her guilt, while illuminating the true depth of the debt she could never hope to repay. His stories of their early days as a family, when Belamir's own survival had been uncertain but her dedication to the children absolute, painted a picture of devotion that made Nami's complaints seem petty and unworthy. The approaching reconciliation that should have healed the wounds created by adolescent anger and temporary ingratitude was prevented by the arrival of forces that transformed their domestic drama into something far more tragic and permanent. Arlong's conquest of their region was not random predation but calculated expansion. The Fishman's empire growing through systematic subjugation of communities too weak to resist his demands for tribute and submission. The tax that Arlong imposed upon Kokoyashi village was designed to be just barely manageable for most families while remaining devastating for those already struggling with poverty. a system of oppression that ensured maximum suffering while maintaining the pretense of reasonableness. 100,000 berries for adults and 50,000 for children represented more money than many villagers saw in an entire year, transforming survival from challenge into impossibility for anyone without substantial resources. Belamir's savings, carefully accumulated over years of denial and sacrifice, were sufficient to cover her own tribute, but fell far short of what would be required to protect all three members of their family. The mathematical reality of their situation was stark and unforgiving. She could save herself or attempt to save her daughters, but not both, and any choice would result in death for someone she loved more than life itself. The decision she faced was impossible by design. Arlong's system of taxation, crafted to force parents into choosing between their own survival and their children's welfare, psychological torture that preceded physical destruction while maximizing the suffering of those who lacked sufficient resources to meet his demands. The cruelty was methodical and complete, leaving no option that did not involve devastating loss. Genzo's desperate attempt to provide an escape route through the legal fiction that Belamir had no children represented quick thinking motivated by genuine care. His understanding of bureaucratic loopholes, offering a narrow path to survival if she could bring herself to deny the most important relationships of her life. The village registry that showed no record of marriage or adoption could serve as evidence that the girls were not her responsibility, allowing her to purchase her own life at the cost of abandoning them to whatever fate awaited unprotected children. The doctor's urgent whisper that the girls should flee immediately, that their absence would validate Genzo's fiction and allow their mother to live, demonstrated how quickly the community had rallied to protect the family that had become integral to their daily lives. These adults who had watched Nami and Nojiko grow from traumatized infants to beloved children were willing to become complicit in deception if it meant preserving even part of what Arlong threatened to destroy completely. But Belamir's response to this potential salvation revealed the true nature of the love that had sustained their family through years of hardship and uncertainty. Her refusal to deny her daughters, even in the face of certain death, representing the kind of moral courage that no amount of suffering could diminish or compromise. The money she held in her hands was insufficient to save them all, but it was exactly enough to make a statement about what mattered more than survival. Her declaration that the 100,000 berries represented her children's share rather than her own transformed their relationship from convenient fiction to legally binding truth, the public acknowledgement of parenthood sealing their fate, while affirming bonds that death itself could not sever. The embrace that followed was simultaneously reunion and farewell, love expressed in its purest form, despite the knowledge that such expression would cost everything they had built together. Arlong's gun pressed against her head with casual cruelty that spoke to the routine nature of such executions, the fishman's efficiency at ending lives, suggesting that Kokoyasi village was merely the latest in a long series of communities that had learned the price of existing without adequate protection from his expanding empire. The weapon that would end her life was held as casually as any tool, its purpose so familiar that ceremony seemed unnecessary. The final words that passed between mother and daughters carried the weight of entire lifetime, condensed into seconds, love and pride and desperate hope compressed into syllables that would echo in the survivors' memories for years to come. Belamir's voice remained steady, even as tears flowed down her face. Her strength in those final moments, providing her children with example of courage that would sustain them through trials yet to come. The sound of the gunshot that ended her life was designed to carry across the entire village, serving as announcement and warning to anyone who might question Arlong's authority or consider resistance to his rule. The execution was public spectacle as much as practical necessity. demonstration of what happened to those who dared to assert that some bonds were more important than mere survival. Hachi's discovery of Nami's navigational charts transformed what might have been simple conquest into something more complex and potentially profitable. The fishman's recognition of her talent, providing Arlong with opportunity to acquire valuable skills rather than merely eliminating another mouth to feed. Her charts demonstrated abilities that could be exploited for expansion and profit, making her more valuable alive than dead. The brand that marked Nami as property of the Arlong pirates was applied with the same casual efficiency that had characterized her mother's execution. The hot iron pressed against her arm, serving as permanent reminder of her new status, while the pain it inflicted was insignificant compared to the emotional wounds that would never fully heal. The symbol burned into her flesh marked the end of childhood and the beginning of a different kind of existence entirely. Genzo's rage at what he perceived as her betrayal was understandable but misguided. His inability to comprehend the psychological manipulation that had transformed a grieving child into a parent collaborator, demonstrating how quickly desperation could cloud judgment, even among those motivated by genuine love. His exile of her from the village was intended as punishment, but became mercy, freeing her from the need to witness daily reminders of everything she had lost. The conversation with Nojiko at Belamir's grave revealed the true nature of Nami's apparent collaboration. Her decision to work for their mother's murderer, motivated not by greed or treachery, but by desperate hope that sufficient service might eventually purchase the freedom of everyone she loved. The plan she had conceived was ambitious beyond reason, to single-handedly earn the 100 million berries that would buy back their village from the fishmen who had conquered it. The 8 years that followed were marked by careful balance between public cooperation and private rebellion. Nami's service as Arlong's cartographer, providing her with access to resources and information, while her covert activities as thief and saboteur generated the funds she needed for her impossible mission. Each map she drew expanded her captor's power, while each treasure she stole brought her closer to the goal that sustained her through daily reminders of her degraded status. Her encounters with other pirate crews during these years were exercises in calculated risk. Her ability to infiltrate their organizations and steal their wealth depending on skills that had been honed through years of desperation and careful observation. The reputation she built as the cat burglar who could slip through any defense was earned through countless nights of terror and triumph, each successful theft another step toward the freedom that remained perpetually just beyond reach. The technique she had learned from watching Belmir's interactions with Genzo was refined and perfected during these criminal enterprises. Her understanding of male psychology, allowing her to manipulate targets whose guard had been lowered by feminine charm deployed with surgical precision. The innocent flirtation she had observed as a child became weapon in the hands of someone who understood that survival often required using every advantage available. The money she accumulated was hidden with care that bordered on obsession. Each berry counted and recounted while she calculated how much remained before she could approach Arlong with the offer that would restore everything his conquest had destroyed. The goal of 100 million berries seemed impossibly distant during her early years of service, but gradual progress made it seem achievable rather than merely wishful thinking. The isolation she endured during these years of service was perhaps more psychologically damaging than the physical hardships or moral compromises that her situation demanded. The necessity of maintaining her disguise as willing collaborator, preventing her from seeking comfort or support from anyone who might understand her true motivations. She became expert at concealing pain behind smiles, at projecting confidence while drowning in despair, at maintaining hope while surrounded by evidence that such hope might be misplaced. The villages and islands she visited during her travels with Arlong's crew provided her with glimpses of what life could be like for those fortunate enough to exist beyond the reach of systematic oppression, though such observations only deepened her understanding of what had been stolen from her own people. The contrast between free communities and her conquered homeland served as constant reminder of what she was fighting to restore. The navigational skills that made her valuable to Arlong also provided her with detailed knowledge of weather patterns, ocean currents, and geographical features that would eventually prove crucial to her escape from the Fishman's control. Each chart she created was simultaneously tool of oppression and potential instrument of liberation, depending on who possessed the knowledge to interpret and utilize the information it contained. The 8 years of servitude that preceded her encounter with Luffy had transformed a grieving child into someone whose understanding of human nature was both sophisticated and deeply cynical, her experiences teaching her that people could be manipulated, that loyalty could be purchased, and that survival often required sacrificing principles that more fortunate individuals could afford to maintain. Yet beneath this protective shell of calculated selfishness, the girl who had been willing to steal books to feed her curiosity remained intact, waiting for circumstances that might allow her to trust again. The wilderness of Drum Island stretched endlessly in all directions, its snow-covered peaks and frozen forests creating a landscape so harsh that even the hardiest creatures struggled to survive its brutal winters and brief, unforgiving summers. Among the reindeer herds that migrated across these treacherous slopes, a calf was born, whose blue nose marked him as different from his fellows, in ways that would define every aspect of his existence, from his first breath until the day he discovered that being different might not necessarily mean being worthless or unwanted by everyone who encountered him. The herd's rejection of young Chopper was immediate and absolute, their instinctive understanding that his unusual coloring represented some form of genetic abnormality, triggering responses that had been shaped by countless generations of evolution, favoring conformity over individuality. The blue nose that made him unique also made him vulnerable, a visible sign that he did not belong among them and could never be accepted as part of their closely knit community, no matter how desperately he might desire such acceptance. His attempts to integrate himself into the herd's social structure were met with increasingly violent rejection, the adult reindeer viewing his persistence not as endearing determination, but as dangerous refusal to accept his proper place in the natural order. The other calves learned quickly to avoid him, their own survival instincts warning them that association with someone so obviously marked as different might result in their own ostracization from the group that provided protection and belonging. The loneliness that consumed his early years was perhaps more devastating than the physical hardships of surviving in such a hostile environment. The knowledge that he was fundamentally alone in a world where cooperation and mutual support meant the difference between life and death. The sight of other families playing and caring for each other served as constant reminder of everything he lacked. Relationships that seemed to exist for every creature except himself. His discovery of the Hito Hito no Mi hidden in the snow seemed like divine providence, though he had no understanding of what devil fruits were or what consuming one might mean for his future. The hunger that drove him to eat the strange-looking fruit was both physical and emotional. Desperation for sustenance combining with unconscious hope that something, anything, might change his circumstances for the better. The transformation that followed was gradual but profound, his developing human intelligence, allowing him to understand, in increasingly sophisticated ways, just how completely he had been rejected by those whose acceptance he had most desperately craved. The self-awareness that came with his new cognitive abilities was both gift and curse, providing him with mental capacities that no other reindeer possessed, while simultaneously making him even more obviously different than before. His ability to walk upright and manipulate objects with his newly dexterous hooves created possibilities that had never existed during his purely animal existence. But these capabilities came at the cost of any remaining hope that he might eventually find acceptance among his own species. The reindeer who had merely avoided him before now viewed him with active fear and hostility, seeing in his transformed state something that violated the fundamental laws that governed their world. The decision to leave his herd was not really a choice, but an acknowledgement of reality, his continued presence among them, creating tensions that threatened the stability of the entire group, while offering him nothing but increasing isolation and potential violence. The solitude that awaited him in the wilderness seemed preferable to the active rejection he faced from creatures who should have been his family, but who now treated him as abomination, to be driven away or destroyed. His early attempts to find acceptance among the human settlements of Drum Island proved even more traumatic than his rejection by the reindeer. The villagers' terror at his appearance, triggering responses that went far beyond mere fear to encompass the kind of primal revulsion that people felt when confronted with something that challenged their understanding of what was natural and proper. His hybrid form, neither fully human nor completely animal, struck them as monstrous in ways that made rational communication impossible. The weapons they turned against him were wielded not with calculated cruelty, but with genuine panic, their bullets and blades representing desperate attempts to destroy something that their minds could not categorize or accept as legitimate part of their world. The wounds they inflicted were accompanied by screams and curses that made clear their belief that his very existence was offense against the natural order that needed to be corrected through violence. It was during one of these terrifying encounters with human hostility that Dr. Hiriluk appeared like salvation incarnate. His willingness to approach, rather than flee, marking him as fundamentally different from every other person Chopper had encountered. The old man's lack of fear in the face of what others saw as monster suggested either tremendous courage or complete madness, though Chopper was too desperate for human contact to care which explanation might be more accurate. The acceptance that Hiriluk offered was immediate and unconditional. His medical training, having taught him to see past surface appearances to the suffering individual beneath, while his own eccentric personality made him naturally sympathetic to others who existed outside society's accepted boundaries. The invitation to become his assistant represented the first time anyone had ever suggested that Chopper might possess value beyond what his appearance might indicate. The medical knowledge that Hiriluk shared was often questionable and sometimes dangerously inaccurate, his enthusiasm for healing far exceeding his actual competence in the field that had captured his imagination. Yet his dedication to helping others was absolutely genuine. His belief that every disease could be cured if sufficient effort and creativity were applied, providing Chopper with his first exposure to the kind of optimism that refused to accept defeat, even when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. The philosophy that accompanied these medical lessons proved far more valuable than the technical knowledge. Hiriluk's conviction that the Jolly Roger represented hope rather than terror fundamentally altering Chopper's understanding of symbols and their meaning. The skull and crossbones that had previously meant death and danger was recontextualized as representation of the courage required to pursue dreams that others might find foolish or impossible. His mentor's stories of the sakura blossoms that bloomed for only brief moments each year but filled observers with joy disproportionate to their fleeting beauty became metaphor for the way that even small acts of kindness or healing could illuminate dark periods in ways that lasted far longer than their immediate duration. The idea that doctors were like those cherry trees, bringing beauty and hope to lives that might otherwise be consumed by suffering and despair, provided Chopper with sense of purpose that his previous existence had completely lacked. The gradual revelation of Hiriluk's own terminal illness added poignancy to their relationship that transformed every shared moment into something precious and irreplaceable. Though the old doctor's attempts to conceal his condition were motivated by desire to protect his young assistant from the kind of loss that might destroy his faith in medicine's power to heal. The irony that someone so dedicated to curing others was being consumed by disease he could not treat was not lost on either of them. The decision to send Chopper away as his condition worsened represented Hiriluk's final act of compassion towards someone who had become far more than mere assistant or student. His recognition that witnessing his death might traumatize the young reindeer in ways that could permanently damage his ability to trust or love others. The harsh words and apparent rejection were designed to create emotional distance that would make the eventual separation less devastating. But Chopper's understanding of his mentor's true condition led him to undertake the most dangerous journey of his young life. His determination to find the Amudaki mushroom that might cure Hiriluk's illness, driving him to brave dangers that should have been far beyond his capabilities. The medical text that described the mushroom's properties had been marked with skull and crossbones symbol that Hiriluk had taught him to interpret as sign of hope rather than warning of danger. The expedition into the treacherous mountain regions, where the Amudaki grew, tested every survival skill he had learned during his years of solitary existence. The hostile environment and predatory creatures that inhabited those remote areas, creating challenges that would have defeated most experienced explorers. His small size and hybrid nature proved advantageous in some situations while creating additional vulnerabilities in others. The encounter with his former herd during this desperate mission added emotional trauma to the physical dangers he already faced. Their recognition of what he had become triggering violent responses that went beyond mere territorial defense to encompass the kind of existential horror that his transformation represented to their simple understanding. The attack that followed was intended not just to drive him away, but to destroy something that challenged their conception of what was possible or acceptable. The injuries he sustained during this assault nearly ended his mission before he could complete it. Broken bones and deep lacerations combining with exhaustion and exposure to push his body beyond its normal limits of endurance. Only his absolute dedication to saving the man who had shown him kindness kept him moving forward when every rational consideration suggested that continuing would mean certain death. The successful harvest of the mushroom felt like triumph of determination over impossible odds, though the journey back to Hiriluk's house proved even more challenging than the original expedition had been. His weakened condition made every step an exercise in willpower overcoming physical limitation, his body running on reserves of energy that should have been exhausted days earlier. His arrival at the cabin, in a state of near collapse, bearing the medicine that had cost him so much to obtain, represented the culmination of everything Hiriluk had taught him about the importance of never giving up when someone's life hung in the balance. The old doctor's horror at the condition of his assistant was matched only by his gratitude for the sacrifice that had been made on his behalf, though his medical knowledge told him that the price paid had been far too high for any potential benefit. The treatment of Chopper's injuries became Hiriluk's final medical procedure, his skilled hands repairing damage that might have been permanent, while his heart broke at the sight of wounds that had been inflicted because of devotion he felt unworthy of receiving. The metal brace that reinforced the cracked antler was both practical necessity and symbolic representation of how love could make broken things functional again. The revelation that the mushroom Chopper had risked everything to obtain was actually deadly poison rather than medicine created a moral crisis that neither of them was prepared to handle. "Doctor," Correa's harsh explanation of the boy's ignorance serving as brutal introduction to the reality that good intentions were insufficient protection against the consequences of inadequate knowledge. The irony that an act of pure love had nearly resulted in the death of its intended beneficiary was almost too cruel to comprehend. Hiriluk's decision to consume the poisonous medicine rather than allow Chopper to bear responsibility for his death represented the final expression of the love and protection that had defined their relationship from its beginning. His recognition that the psychological damage of believing himself a murderer would be far more devastating to the young reindeer than simple grief over a natural death. The smile that accompanied his consumption of the fatal dose was genuine expression of gratitude for having experienced unconditional love during his final months. The private ceremony that followed was perhaps the most moving moment in either of their lives. Hiriluk's acknowledgement that his time with Chopper had been the happiest period of his existence, providing the young reindeer with understanding that their relationship had been mutually beneficial rather than one-sided. Charity. The old doctor's gratitude for having been loved so completely was matched only by his pride in what his assistant had become. The revelation that King Wapol's summons had been trap designed to eliminate the island's remaining doctors transformed what might have been medical emergency into moral test that Hiriluk could not fail, regardless of the personal cost involved. His willingness to risk his life on the remote possibility that people might genuinely need his help demonstrated the kind of selfless dedication that had originally attracted Chopper to medicine as calling rather than mere profession. His final journey to Drumcastle was undertaken with full knowledge that death awaited him there. Yet his joy at discovering that no one was actually ill overshadowed any resentment he might have felt at being deceived. The trap that had been set for him became opportunity to make a final statement about what it meant to be Doctor, someone whose primary concern was always the welfare of those who suffered, regardless of personal consequences. The speech he delivered before his self-destruction was intended primarily for Chopper, though the assembled witnesses would carry his words far beyond that frozen castle to influence people he would never meet. His declaration that men died not from disease or violence but from being forgotten was both challenge and promise, demand that his sacrifice be given meaning through the actions of those who survived him. The explosion that ended his life was visible across the entire island, a beacon of defiance against the forces that sought to eliminate compassion and healing from their world. The smoke that rose from Drumcastle carried with it the dreams and hopes of someone who had refused to accept that suffering was inevitable or that individual action was meaningless in the face of systematic oppression. Chopper's arrival at the castle in the aftermath of the explosion was motivated by grief and rage rather than rational planning, his emotional state making him dangerous to anyone who might try to prevent him from reaching the place where his mentor had died. The transformation into his full animal form represented complete surrender to instincts that demanded violent response to the loss of everything that had given his life meaning and purpose. Dalton's intervention was motivated by recognition of the pain that drove the young reindeer's rampage, the captain's own moral awakening making him sympathetic to someone whose world had been destroyed by the same systematic cruelty that was consuming their island. His advice to live rather than die for a diseased country represented wisdom born from experience with the corrosive effects of serving evil masters. The journey to Doctor Correa's house was undertaken in a state of emotional numbness that made physical hardship irrelevant compared to the psychological devastation of losing the only person who had ever truly understood and accepted him. The woman, who had been Hiriluk's contemporary and occasional rival, represented his only remaining connection to the medical knowledge that had been their shared passion. The plea that he made to be taught medicine was perhaps the most important request of his life. His recognition that good intentions were insufficient qualification for healing others, driving him to seek the technical competence that might prevent future tragedies caused by ignorance disguised as compassion. The promise to become a doctor capable of curing any disease was simultaneously tribute to Hiriluk's memory and commitment to ensuring that his sacrifice would not be meaningless. The 6 years of study that followed were marked by discipline and dedication that honored the memory of someone whose enthusiasm had far exceeded his actual knowledge. Chopper's determination to master every aspect of medical science, driven by understanding that the lives of future patients would depend on the thoroughness of his preparation. Each technique learned and principle mastered was offering placed on the altar of a mentor whose love had made such growth possible. The skills he developed under Kureha's harsh but effective tutelage transformed him from enthusiastic amateur into genuine healer, someone whose knowledge was based on proven science rather than wishful thinking or dangerous assumption. The transformation was painful and sometimes humiliating. His natural optimism frequently crushed by encounters with the brutal realities of medical practice, but each setback only strengthened his resolve to become worthy of the dreams that had been entrusted to his care. The island of Ohara floated in the west blue like a jewel of accumulated wisdom, its ancient trees rising toward the sky with trunks so massive that entire libraries had been carved into their living wood over the course of centuries. The tree of knowledge stood at the heart of this scholarly paradise, its branches heavy with books that contained the accumulated learning of generations, while its roots reached deep into earth that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that most of the world had forgotten ever existed. Into this sanctuary of learning, a child was born whose destiny would be shaped not by the peaceful pursuit of knowledge that defined her homeland, but by the terrible price that the world government demanded from those who dared to seek truths that challenged the carefully constructed version of history they had spent 8 centuries perfecting. Nico Robin's birth should have been cause for celebration among people who valued intellectual curiosity above all other human traits. But her arrival was marked by absence rather than joy. Nico Olivia's departure, when her daughter was barely 2 years old, represented the kind of sacrifice that scholars throughout history had made in pursuit of knowledge that seemed more important than personal happiness or family obligations. The quest to uncover the true history of the world, to read the poneglyphs that held secrets from the void century, called to her with a voice that drowned out even maternal instinct and the bonds that should have anchored her to domestic responsibility. The decision to leave Robin in the care of her brother's family was rationalized as temporary necessity, a brief separation that would allow important work to be completed before returning to the normal rhythms of motherhood and child-rearing. But the pursuit of forbidden knowledge proved more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated, months stretching into years while the little girl who waited for her mother's return grew from toddler into child without the presence of the woman who should have been the center of her world. The relatives who reluctantly accepted responsibility for Robin's upbringing made no attempt to conceal their resentment at being burdened with a child they had never wanted and could barely afford to support. Their house became a place of conditional tolerance rather than genuine welcome, every meal provided and every piece of clothing given accompanied by reminders of the debt she owed for their grudging charity. Her uncle's treatment of her was shaped by his own frustrated ambitions and the bitter recognition that his sister had chosen scholarship over family responsibility, leaving him to deal with consequences he felt unqualified to handle. His anger at Olivia's abandonment was regularly displaced onto the child who served as living reminder of choices that had disrupted his own modest plans for a quiet, uncomplicated life. The verbal abuse that became Robin's daily reality was punctuated by physical violence that stopped just short of causing permanent damage, her uncle's careful modulation of his cruelty, suggesting that he understood the difference between discipline and assault, while remaining determined to ensure that she never felt secure or valued in what should have been her home. The isolation imposed upon her during family celebrations and gatherings was perhaps more damaging than the beatings, each exclusion serving as reminder that she existed on the margins of even this reluctant sanctuary. Her devil fruit powers manifested during these early years of rejection and loneliness, the Hana Hana no Mi's abilities, allowing her to sprout additional limbs from any surface, providing her with capabilities that should have been wondrous, but instead became another source of fear and ostracization. The sight of extra arms emerging from walls or furniture triggered responses in adults and children alike that went beyond mere surprise to encompass the kind of primal terror that people felt when confronted with phenomena their minds could not easily categorize. The whispered accusations that she was demon or monster were spoken just loudly enough for her to overhear, each cruel assessment of her nature adding weight to the growing conviction that there was something fundamentally wrong with her existence. The parents who forbade their children from playing with her were protecting their offspring from contamination they could not define but instinctively feared, their superstitions creating social barriers that transformed her isolation from circumstantial hardship into systematic exclusion. Yet amidst this rejection and fear, the tree of knowledge offered sanctuary that her uncle's house could never provide, its vast libraries welcoming her presence with the kind of unconditional acceptance that seemed impossible to find among living people. Professor Clover's recognition of her intellectual gifts provided the first positive validation she had ever received. His encouragement of her studies, representing acknowledgement that she possessed value beyond the burden that others perceived her to be. The books that surrounded her in those carved chambers became more than sources of information. They were companions that never judged her appearance or abilities, friends whose wisdom was freely shared without expectation of payment or demonstration of worthiness. The knowledge she absorbed with unprecedented speed was motivated not merely by curiosity, but by desperate hunger for understanding that might explain why her existence seemed to inspire fear rather than affection. Her achievement in passing the archaeological examination at age 8 was remarkable not just for its precocity, but for what it represented. Proof that intelligence and dedication could overcome the disadvantages of birth, and circumstance that knowledge was one realm where her unusual abilities were asset rather than liability. The title of scholar carried with it recognition and respect that had been absent from every other aspect of her young life. But even this triumph was shadowed by the understanding that certain knowledge was forbidden, that the true history of the world was considered too dangerous for even qualified scholars to pursue without facing consequences that could destroy not just individuals, but entire communities. The poneglyphs that held the secrets of the Void Century were mentioned only in whispers, their study regulated by laws that carried penalties severe enough to discourage all but the most dedicated researchers. Her expression of interest in following her mother's path toward understanding these ancient texts was met with alarm that seemed disproportionate to the academic nature of her inquiry. Professor Clover's threat to ban her from the library, revealing depths of fear that suggested the dangers involved went far beyond academic disagreement or professional rivalry. The knowledge she sought was not merely difficult to obtain, but actively suppressed by forces powerful enough to make even the bravest scholars reconsider their priorities. The tears that followed this rejection were born not just from immediate disappointment, but from the growing recognition that even in the one place where she had found acceptance, there were limits to what she would be allowed to pursue, boundaries that seemed designed to prevent her from understanding the very mysteries that had driven her mother to abandon everything familiar and safe. The library that had been her sanctuary suddenly felt like another form of prison, its walls containing not just knowledge but the rules that governed who could access which portions of that accumulated wisdom. Her flight to the shore, where she encountered Jaguar D, Saul was motivated by grief and frustration that had been building for years, the need to escape from rejection and limitation driving her toward the ocean that represented the unknown possibilities that lay beyond her constrained existence. The giant who emerged from the waters seemed like a creature from the fairy tales she had read. Too fantastical to be real, yet too immediate to be dismissed as imagination or hallucination. Their friendship developed with the kind of innocent joy that had been absent from her life since her mother's departure. Saul's gentle nature and genuine interest in her welfare, providing the first unconditional affection she had experienced in memory. His stories of adventure and exploration opened her eyes to possibilities that existed beyond the academic pursuits that had consumed her attention. Worlds where physical courage mattered as much as intellectual achievement, and where friendship could transcend the barriers of species and size. The revelation that he knew her mother transformed their casual friendship into something approaching family connection. Though the news he brought was more alarming than reassuring, carrying implications that suggested Olivia's quest for forbidden knowledge had attracted the attention of forces far more dangerous than academic censorship or professional disapproval. The battleships that pursued her were not engaging in scholarly debate, but implementing policies that could only be enforced through violence and intimidation. The warning that such vessels were approaching O'Hara created urgency that transformed abstract danger into immediate threat. The peaceful pursuit of knowledge suddenly revealed as activity dangerous enough to warrant military intervention. The scholars who had dedicated their lives to preserving and understanding the past found themselves facing destruction that would eliminate not just their research but their very existence. 8 centuries of accumulated learning, threatened by policies that viewed certain truths as too dangerous to be allowed to survive. Olivia's return to the island should have been cause for celebration and reunion, but the circumstances that brought her home were so dire that personal joy became subordinate to the larger catastrophe that threatened everything they had built together. Her warnings about the government's awareness of their research created panic among people who had never imagined that academic inquiry could be considered criminal activity deserving of lethal response. The scholars' decision to remain and protect their accumulated knowledge, rather than flee to safety, demonstrated the kind of courage that valued intellectual legacy over personal survival, their recognition that some things were worth dying for, if death was the price demanded for their preservation. The Tree of Knowledge represented more than mere repository of information. It was symbol of humanity's determination to understand itself and its history, regardless of the costs such understanding might impose. The separation between mother and daughter that Olivia insisted upon was motivated by love rather than rejection. Her recognition that association with wanted criminals would mark Robin for elimination, along with the rest of the community that had harbored forbidden researchers. The denial that they were related was intended as protection rather than abandonment, though the psychological impact on a child who had spent years dreaming of reunion was devastating regardless of the maternal intentions behind such cruelty. But the arrival of CP9 agents transformed their careful plans into chaos. The government's determination to eliminate all traces of forbidden research, extending to anyone who might have been exposed to dangerous knowledge, regardless of their age or degree of actual involvement. Robin's innocent declaration of her archaeological credentials and ability to read poneglyphs sealed her fate as surely as any conscious act of rebellion. Her proud announcement of achievements that should have been celebrated, instead marking her as threat to be eliminated. The buster call that followed was not military operation but systematic annihilation. 10 warships and 5 vice admirals deployed not to capture criminals but to erase every trace of research that challenged official historical narratives. The firepower directed against a community of scholars was proportionate to the perceived threat their knowledge represented, rather than any actual violence they had committed. or weapons they possessed. Professor Clover's final attempt to reveal the name of the ancient kingdom whose history had been erased was silenced by bullets that spoke more eloquently than words about the government's determination to prevent certain truths from reaching public awareness. His death marked the end not just of individual life, but of scholarly traditions that had survived for centuries. Knowledge that would die with the men and women who had dedicated their lives to preserving it. The reunion between mother and daughter that should have been filled with joy and relief instead became farewell conducted under the shadow of approaching death, their conversation compressed into minutes that had to contain years of unexpressed love and accumulated longing. Olivia's acknowledgement of Robin's growth and achievements carried weight that ordinary praise could never achieve. Recognition from the woman whose approval she had craved since early childhood finally granted when it could no longer sustain them through the trials that lay ahead. The charge that Olivia placed upon her daughter's shoulders was perhaps the heaviest burden that any child had ever been asked to bear. Not just to survive the destruction that would claim everyone else she had ever known, but to carry forward the knowledge that their community had died to preserve. The responsibility for maintaining the true history of the world was being transferred to someone barely old enough to understand what such guardianship would require of her in the years to come. Saul's final act of protection was motivated by the same love that had made their friendship so precious. His willingness to sacrifice himself for someone who had brought joy into his life, representing the kind of selfless devotion that transcended species and circumstances. His battle against Aokiji was hopeless from its beginning. But hope had never been the point. The goal was to provide Robin with enough time to escape, to ensure that Olivia's sacrifice and the scholars' deaths would have meaning beyond mere martyrdom. The lesson he taught her about laughter was perhaps the most important gift she would ever receive. His understanding that joy could be maintained even in the face of overwhelming tragedy, providing her with psychological tool that would prove essential for survival in a world that viewed her very existence as crime deserving of punishment. The ability to laugh, to find reasons for happiness despite loss and persecution, would become her most valuable skill during the decades of loneliness that awaited her beyond the burning island. Aokiji's decision to spare her life was motivated by complex considerations that went beyond simple mercy. His recognition that absolute justice could lead to absolute corruption, creating space for the kind of moral flexibility that allowed individual conscience to override institutional policy. The ice bridge he created for her escape was simultaneously act of rebellion against his orders and acknowledgement that some lives were worth preserving, regardless of the dangers they might represent to established authority. The bounty placed upon her head transformed a traumatized child into the most wanted criminal in the world, her ability to read poneglyphs making her dangerous, not because of any violence she had committed, but because of the knowledge she carried in her mind. The title, Devil of Ohara, was designed to ensure that she would find no refuge anywhere, that fear would follow her wherever she might seek sanctuary or support. The 20 years that followed were marked by betrayal and abandonment, so consistent that they became routine rather than surprising. Each relationship that developed with promise of genuine connection, eventually poisoned by the fear that her presence brought to everyone who sheltered her. The pattern repeated itself across islands and organizations. Temporary alliances dissolved when the risks of association became too great for her hosts to accept. The pirates and criminals who took her in were motivated by their own needs rather than compassion for her circumstances. Her ability to read ancient texts valuable enough to justify the risks involved in harboring someone whose capture would bring enormous rewards. But even these mercenary relationships eventually crumbled when pursuit became too intense or other opportunities presented themselves, leaving her to face the world alone once again. The accusations that her existence was sin and plague were spoken so frequently that she began to believe them herself. The constant reinforcement of her unworthiness creating psychological wounds that were deeper and more persistent than any physical injuries she sustained during her years of flight. The world's rejection was so complete and universal that she began to question whether the scholars of O'Hara had been wrong to try to preserve her life at such enormous cost. Yet she persevered through decades of isolation because she understood that her survival was not just personal victory but continuation of everything that O'Hara had represented, the preservation of knowledge and truth that justified every sacrifice that had been made on her behalf. The poneglyphs she sought and studied during her wanderings were not just historical artifacts but connections to the community that had died to preserve the right to seek such understanding. The arrival at Baroque Works represented her latest attempt to find stability and purpose among people whose criminal activities provided them with reasons to resist government authority, though even this alliance was built upon mutual exploitation rather than genuine trust or affection. Crocodile's interest in her abilities was purely practical, her knowledge of ancient texts valuable for his schemes rather than appreciated for its own sake. The 4 years she spent as part of that organization were marked by careful emotional distance, her experience having taught her that attachment led only to pain when circumstances inevitably forced separation or betrayal. She performed her duties with competence and loyalty, while maintaining the kind of psychological barriers that protected her from hoping for more than temporary cooperation based on shared interests. But beneath the surface calm that she had learned to project, the girl who had once laughed with a gentle giant and dreamed of understanding the world's true history remained intact, waiting for circumstances that might allow her to trust again, to believe that somewhere in the vast ocean there might exist people who could value her for who she was rather than what she knew or what rewards her capture might bring. The loneliness that defined her existence was not mere absence of companionship, but the deeper isolation that came from being the sole survivor of a destroyed civilization, the last keeper of knowledge that the world had tried to eliminate, but which demanded to be preserved regardless of the personal costs such preservation required. She carried within herself not just the memory of O'Hara, but the responsibility for ensuring that its sacrifice had meaning beyond the tragedy of its destruction. The South Blue stretched beneath cloudy skies that had witnessed countless tragedies of abandonment and cruelty, but few as calculated and heartless as the moment when 2 pirate parents decided that their infant son represented nothing more than inconvenient burden to be discarded at the first opportunity. The ship that had been Cutty Flam's first home became the scene of his first betrayal when his mother and father chose to throw him overboard rather than allow parental responsibility to interfere with their pursuit of treasure and adventure on the high seas. The ocean that should have claimed his life instead delivered him to salvation in the form of Tom, the legendary fishman shipwright, whose reputation extended far beyond Water 7 to encompass anyone who understood the difference between vessels that merely floated and ships that embodied the dreams of those who sailed them. The master craftsman's rescue of the drowning child was motivated not by obligation or sentiment, but by recognition of potential that revealed itself in the crude cannons the boy had somehow constructed from scrap materials found aboard his parents' vessel. The workshop that became young Flam's new home was unlike anything he had experienced during his brief time with the pirates who had sired him, its atmosphere charged with creative energy and dedication to ideals that transcended mere profit or personal advancement. Tom's approach to shipbuilding was simultaneously art and science. His understanding of how wood and metal and canvas could be combined to create vessels that lived and breathed with the dreams of their captains, transforming what might have been simple construction work into something approaching divine creation. The rivalry that developed between Flam and Iceberg was born not from malice, but from the healthy competition that arose when two talented individuals pursued the same goals through radically different methodologies and philosophical approaches. Where Iceberg focused on traditional shipbuilding techniques refined through centuries of accumulated wisdom, Flam gravitated toward innovation and experimentation that pushed the boundaries of what conventional maritime engineering considered possible or practical. The nickname that Iceberg bestowed upon his fellow apprentice was intended as gentle mockery of a name that seemed too dignified for someone whose approach to life was characterized by explosive enthusiasm and disregard for conventional limitations. Yet Frankie embraced this new identity with characteristic exuberance, his adoption of the shortened moniker representing rejection of everything associated with the parents who had abandoned him in favor of the family he had chosen among the craftsmen and dreamers who populated Tom's workshop. The battle Frankies that emerged from his imagination were testament to his belief that ships could be more than mere transportation, that properly designed vessels could serve as weapons capable of hunting the sea monsters that terrorized merchant shipping and fishing fleets throughout the Grand Line. His warships represented synthesis between his natural mechanical aptitude and the aggressive instincts that had been shaped by his abandonment and subsequent rescue, proof that even those who had been rejected could create things of power and beauty. Tom's patient instruction tempered Flam's raw enthusiasm with the kind of disciplined knowledge that transformed wild creativity into achievable innovation, though the master shipwright was careful never to completely suppress the originality that made his youngest apprentice so valuable. The balance between encouraging experimentation and maintaining quality standards required wisdom that came only from decades of experience with both the possibilities and limitations that governed maritime construction. The visit from the Roger Pirates during their final voyage represented one of the most significant moments in young Frankie's development. His exposure to legendary figures who had achieved everything he dreamed of, providing him with concrete examples of what dedication and skill could achieve when properly applied. Kozuki Oden's invitation to join their crew was perhaps the greatest honor that could have been offered to someone of his age and experience. Recognition from the strongest samurai in the world that his talents were worthy of the greatest adventure in history. Yet his refusal of this extraordinary opportunity revealed character traits that would define his entire approach to relationships and responsibility. His understanding that the family he had found in Tom's workshop was more valuable than any adventure he might pursue in the company of strangers, regardless of how legendary their reputation or promising their offer of excitement and discovery might be. The decision to remain loyal to those who had shown him love when he was most vulnerable would resonate through every choice he made for the rest of his life. The trial that put Tom's life at risk 12 years later was ostensibly about his construction of the Oro Jackson for the previous Pirate King, but the underlying motivation was the world government's determination to acquire the blueprints of Pluton that had been entrusted to his care centuries earlier. The irony that someone was facing execution for creating the ship that had achieved the greatest feat in maritime history was not lost on anyone who understood the true nature of justice, as it was practiced by those who claimed to represent order and civilization. Tom's bargain to construct the sea train in exchange for a reprieve was perhaps the most audacious negotiation in the history of jurisprudence. His offer to provide genuine benefit to the community that was judging him, demonstrating the kind of practical idealism that characterized everything he accomplished. The railway that would connect Water 7 to Eni's lobby represented more than mere transportation infrastructure. It was proof that individual genius could serve collective benefit when properly channeled and supported. The 10 years that followed were marked by achievement that exceeded even Tom's ambitious promises, the sea train lines that emerged from his workshop transforming travel throughout the region, while providing employment and prosperity that had previously been impossible to imagine. The social impact of connecting isolated communities was matched only by the economic benefits that flowed from improved transportation. Tom's engineering genius creating ripple effects that touched every aspect of life in their corner of the world. But the success that should have guaranteed Tom's freedom also attracted the attention of those whose interests were served by maintaining systems of control and oppression, rather than fostering innovation that might challenge established hierarchies. Spandam's arrival with renewed demands for the Pluton blueprints represented the kind of bureaucratic persistence that would pursue its objectives, regardless of the consequences for individuals or communities that stood in its way. The frame-up that utilized Frankie's battle Frankies to attack judicial installations was masterfully orchestrated to implicate both the young inventor and his beloved mentor in terrorism that could justify the harshest possible response from authorities who had been seeking excuses to eliminate obstacles to their larger objectives. The use of Frankie's own creations to destroy everything he cared about was psychological warfare designed to break his spirit along with ending Tom's life. Tom's assumption of responsibility for the attack, rather than allowing his apprentice to face consequences for innovations that had been corrupted by others, demonstrated the depth of paternal love that had motivated his rescue of the abandoned child years earlier. His recognition that Frankie's guilt over the misuse of his inventions might prove more devastating than any external punishment led him to sacrifice his own freedom to preserve the psychological welfare of someone who had become far more than mere student or employee. The philosophy he articulated about loving one's creations, regardless of how they might be misused by others, provided Frankie with framework for understanding that innovation carried responsibilities that extended beyond immediate applications or intended purposes. The ships and weapons he built would inevitably be judged not just by their technical excellence, but by the uses to which they were put. Yet this knowledge could not be allowed to paralyze creativity or prevent the pursuit of dreams that required physical manifestation to achieve their full potential. Spandam's assault on the unconscious Tom was perhaps the most craven act of violence that Frankie had ever witnessed. The bureaucrat's cowardice in attacking someone who could not defend himself, revealing character so base that it justified any response that might follow. The rage that drove Frankie to protect his mentor was motivated not just by personal loyalty, but by moral outrage at seeing evil triumph through methods too despicable for honorable people to anticipate or counter effectively. The sea train that carried Tom toward his execution became the instrument of Frankie's near destruction. The vehicle that represented the pinnacle of his mentor's achievement transformed into a weapon that crushed the body of someone trying desperately to prevent an injustice that all his skill and determination were inadequate to stop. The irony that Tom's greatest creation became the means of destroying those who loved him most was cruelty that seemed designed by malevolent fate rather than mere coincidence. The survival that followed his collision with the sea train was achieved only through desperate improvisation with materials that should have been inadequate for sustaining human life. Frankie's transformation into cyborg, representing both triumph of will over circumstance and permanent reminder of the price that had been paid for his inability to protect those he loved most. The mechanical components that replaced destroyed organs and limbs were testament to ingenuity born from necessity, proof that the human spirit could adapt to any trauma when survival required such flexibility. The years of recovery and self-modification that followed were marked by gradual acceptance of his new hybrid nature, though the psychological wounds inflicted by Tom's death proved far more difficult to heal than any physical damage he had sustained. The mechanical body he constructed for himself was simultaneously armor against future harm and monument to the mentor whose sacrifice had made his continued existence possible. Iceberg's offer to take the Pluton blueprints and leave the island forever was motivated by recognition that the world government's pursuit of those ancient designs would never cease, as long as they believed such knowledge still existed somewhere within their reach. The separation that followed was perhaps the most difficult decision either young man had ever made, their brotherhood forged through shared apprenticeship and mutual loss making any parting painful beyond description. Yet Frankie's decision to remain on Water 7 rather than seek safety elsewhere was driven by the same loyalty that had kept him in Tom's workshop when the Roger pirates had offered him adventure beyond his wildest dreams. The island that held the graves of his chosen family demanded protection from someone who understood both its value and the dangers that threatened it, responsibilities that could not be abandoned regardless of personal cost or risk. The transformation of the city's back streets into his domain was accomplished through combination of superior firepower and genuine care for outcasts and misfits who found themselves rejected by respectable society. Frankie's creation of Surrogate Family, among the dispossessed, representing attempt to heal wounds that could never be completely closed. The Frankie family that emerged from these relationships was simultaneously criminal organization and mutual support network, their activities straddling the line between illegal profit and community service. The dismantling of ships that entered their territory provided both income and raw materials for the dream vessel that Frankie intended to build when circumstances finally allowed him to pursue the ambitions that had been interrupted by tragedy and transformation. Each piece of salvaged wood and metal was evaluated not just for its immediate utility, but for its potential contribution to the ship that would honor Tom's memory while surpassing anything the legendary craftsman had ever created. The money that accumulated from these various enterprises was carefully divided between immediate needs and long-term goals. Frankie's understanding that the finest materials required enormous financial resources, driving him to accumulate wealth through whatever means were available to someone operating outside conventional legal frameworks. The dream ship that existed only in his imagination demanded Adam wood and other legendary materials that could not be obtained through ordinary commercial channels. The protection he provided to Water 7's citizens was motivated by genuine affection for the community that had given him purpose and family when he had nothing else to sustain him, though his methods were often too crude and violent for respectable people to acknowledge or appreciate openly. The pirates and criminals who might have preyed upon merchants and craftsmen learned to avoid territories where the cyborg's justice was swift and absolute, his reputation for decisive intervention serving as deterrent that words alone could never have achieved. Yet beneath the fearsome exterior that he had constructed to intimidate enemies and protect those he cared about, the boy who had been abandoned by his birth parents and saved by a gentle giant remained intact, waiting for circumstances that might allow him to trust again, to believe that family bonds could be stronger than the forces that had already taken so much from him. The workshop where he labored on projects that honored Tom's memory while pushing the boundaries of what was possible served as shrine to relationships that transcended death and testament to dreams that refused to die regardless of the obstacles that seemed designed to crush them. The blueprints that he carried represented more than mere technical specifications. They were final connection to the mentor whose teachings had shaped every aspect of his character and capabilities. Knowledge that demanded to be preserved and protected until someone worthy of such trust could be found to carry the burden forward. The weight of that responsibility was matched only by his determination to prove worthy of the faith that Tom had placed in him during those final moments when everything they had built together was being torn apart by forces beyond their Robosans. Control, the kingdom that Brooke had served before his musical career began, was lost to the mists of history, its name and location forgotten by all. save those who had lived within its borders and fought beneath its banners during conflicts that had shaped the political landscape of an earlier age. The battle convoy that he had commanded represented the finest military tradition of his homeland, disciplined soldiers whose swordsmanship had been honed through years of training, designed to forge individuals into a cohesive fighting force, capable of defending their nation's interests against any enemy that dared to challenge their sovereignty. The unique style of combat that Brooke had mastered during his years of military service combined traditional swordsmanship with musical elements that transformed battle into something approaching performance art, his blade dancing to rhythms that existed only in his mind while creating melodies through the clash of steel against steel. This synthesis of martial and artistic disciplines had been developed through decades of experimentation and refinement, each technique polished until it achieved the kind of perfection that made combat beautiful rather than merely effective. Yet for all the satisfaction that military achievement had provided, Brooke found himself increasingly drawn to the pure joy of music divorced from its martial applications. His understanding that melody could touch human hearts in ways that no amount of sword skill could ever accomplish, gradually shifting his priorities from conquest to creation. The transition from warrior to musician was not abandonment of his previous identity, but evolution towards something that felt more authentic and meaningful than anything he had previously experienced. The invitation to join Captain Yorkie and the Rumbar Pirates represented opportunity to combine his love of music with the adventure and freedom that military service had never quite provided. Their mission to bring joy and laughter to children throughout the world, offering him purpose that transcended the narrow nationalism that had previously defined his existence. The crew that welcomed him aboard their vessel was united, not by shared geography or political allegiance, but by commitment to ideals that recognized no boundaries save those imposed by their own imagination and creativity. The philosophy that guided their voyage was revolutionary in its simplicity, the belief that happiness was a treasure more valuable than gold, and that sharing such wealth with those who possessed little of their own was the highest calling to which any pirate could aspire. Their concerts on remote islands brought music to communities that might otherwise have gone years without hearing professional performances. Each song they shared creating memories that would sustain their audiences long after the ship had disappeared beyond the horizon. The encounter with Laboon began as chance meeting between species that normally existed in completely separate spheres, the young whale's separation from his pod creating loneliness that resonated with the musicians who understood what it meant to exist outside conventional social structures. The bond that developed between them transcended the usual relationships between humans and animals, built upon mutual recognition of spirits that refused to be constrained by the limitations that others might accept as inevitable. Brooke's suggestion that they play music to cheer the lonely whale revealed his intuitive understanding of melody's power to heal emotional wounds that no medicine could touch. His recognition that Laboon's distress stemmed not from physical ailment, but from the kind of isolation that could only be addressed through genuine connection and shared experience. The concerts that followed created joy that was visible in every movement of the whale's massive form, his delight in their performances, providing the musicians with audience more appreciative than any human crowd they had ever entertained. The whale's determination to follow them into the Grand Line created moral dilemma that had no easy resolution, his obvious desire for continued companionship conflicting with their understanding of the dangers that awaited anyone who dared to challenge the legendary graveyard of pirates' dreams. The discussion that followed revealed depths of concern that went beyond mere inconvenience to encompass genuine fear for the welfare of someone who had become far more than casual companion or amusing pet. Their attempts to convince Laboon to remain in safer waters were motivated by love rather than rejection. Their recognition that the Grand Line's notorious reputation was built upon the bones of countless crews who had believed themselves capable of surviving whatever challenges they might encounter. The whale's inability to understand human language made explanations impossible, leaving them to rely upon actions that he interpreted as abandonment rather than protection. The cruel deception they attempted, ignoring his presence in hopes that he would eventually lose interest and return to his own kind, was perhaps the most difficult decision they had ever made as a crew. Their natural inclination toward kindness and inclusion, conflicting with practical considerations that seemed to demand harsh choices. The temporary success of this strategy, Laboon's apparent departure suggesting that their plan had worked, provided relief that was tinged with regret for the pain they had been forced to inflict on someone who had brought them nothing but joy. The revelation that he had merely hidden himself until they entered the Grand Line demonstrated intelligence and determination that exceeded anything they had previously attributed to his species. His successful infiltration of their planned route, proving that his desire for companionship was stronger than their ability to discourage or prevent it. The fait accompli of his presence left them with choices that ranged from the heartless to the merely difficult, none offering resolution that would satisfy both their affection for him and their concern for his safety. The 3 months they spent at Reverse Mountain repairing their ship became extended farewell that none of them had the courage to acknowledge openly. Each day of preparation for departure waited with understanding that they were moving towards separation that would be far more permanent than any they had previously experienced. The concerts they performed for their whale companion during this period carried emotional intensity that transformed familiar songs into something approaching sacred ritual, melodies that attempted to convey everything they could not express in words he would understand. Crocus's presence at the lighthouse provided them with intermediary, whose knowledge of Laboon's nature and needs offered hope that their departure would not condemn him to the kind of isolation that had originally brought them together. The old man's willingness to serve as caretaker and companion represented sacrifice that went far beyond professional obligation to encompass the kind of devotion that recognized no distinction between species when genuine affection was involved. The promise they made to return after completing their journey around the world was simultaneously genuine commitment and necessary deception. Their understanding that such return was far from guaranteed by the harsh realities of Grand Line navigation, conflicting with their desire to provide hope that might sustain Laboon through the years of waiting that lay ahead. The farewell songs they performed before departure were intended as temporary goodbye rather than final concert, though their tears suggested that they understood the true nature of what was ending. The early stages of their Grand Line adventure were marked by excitement and wonder that made every challenge seem manageable through application of teamwork and musical inspiration. Their concerts on each island they visited serving as both entertainment and proof that their mission remained viable despite the increasing dangers they encountered. The audiences they found were more appreciative than any they had left behind in safer waters, their hunger for joy and beauty intensified by the harsh circumstances that characterized life in the legendary sea. But the Grand Line's reputation as graveyard of dreams was not built upon exaggeration or cowardly rumor, its challenges proving more severe and persistent than even experienced pirates had reason to expect when they first crossed Reverse Mountain, with high hopes and unshakable confidence. The diseases that began to claim crew members were not dramatic battles that could be won through courage and skill, but insidious enemies that eroded strength and will while remaining largely invisible until it was too late for effective treatment. Captain Yorkie's illness was particularly devastating because of his role as both leader and inspiration. His gradual decline, creating uncertainty that affected every aspect of their operation, while his determination to continue performing, despite his obvious suffering, provided example of dedication that was simultaneously admirable and Heartbreaking, the decision he eventually made to separate himself and other infected crew members from their healthy companions was motivated by love that transcended personal desire for their continued presence and support. The plan to escape the Grand Line through the Calm Belt was a desperate gambit that had little chance of success. Their understanding that such waters were protected by sea kings, whose size and ferocity made human survival virtually impossible, conflicting with their recognition that remaining would inevitably result in the spread of infection to crew members who still had chance for recovery and eventual achievement of their shared dreams. The final concert that Yorkie requested before their separation was perhaps the most emotionally charged performance that any of them had ever given. Bink's sake carrying weight that went far beyond its simple lyrics to encompass everything they had shared together and all the dreams they would never have chance to fulfill as complete crew. The melody that had always brought them joy became vehicle for grief and gratitude that no words could adequately express. Brooks' elevation to captain was honor that he had never sought and responsibility that he felt inadequately prepared to shoulder, his musical skills providing no guidance for the leadership challenges that would determine whether the surviving crew members could complete the journey they had begun together. The weight of command was made heavier by the knowledge that every decision would be measured against the standards that Yorkie had established through years of wise and compassionate leadership. The reduced crew that continued toward their goal was bound together by shared loss and determination to honor the sacrifice of their departed companions. Each song they performed carrying echoes of voices that would never again join their harmonies. The new ship they acquired was smaller and less comfortable than their original vessel, but it carried their dreams forward with the same dedication that had motivated their initial departure from safer waters. The Florian Triangle that became their final destination was shrouded in mists that seemed to swallow light and hope with equal efficiency, its perpetual twilight creating an atmosphere of dread that made even the bravest crew members question the wisdom of continuing their voyage through waters that seemed designed to trap and destroy anyone foolish enough to enter their Bacca boundaries. The reports they had heard of ships disappearing without trace in these waters proved to be understatements rather than exaggerations. The battle that ended their dreams was not glorious confrontation that would be remembered in songs and stories, but desperate struggle against enemies whose poison-tipped weapons transformed victory into delayed defeat, their successful defense of their ship becoming meaningless when the toxins began to work their way through systems that no amount of courage or determination could protect. The enemy crew that had seemed defeated proved more dangerous in retreat than they had been in direct combat. The gradual realization that they were all dying created an atmosphere of resigned despair that was lifted only by Brooks' devil fruit powers, his Yomi Yomi no Mi, offering hope that at least one member of their crew might survive to carry their memories and complete their mission. The promise that he would eventually return to Laboon with recordings of their voices provided focus that transformed approaching death from meaningless tragedy into sacrifice that served larger purpose. The tone dial that would preserve their final performance was treated with reverence that reflected its importance as their last gift to the whale who waited for their return. Each note they recorded intended to carry not just melody, but the love and gratitude that had defined their relationship from its beginning. The knowledge that Brooke would eventually play these recordings at Reverse Mountain gave meaning to their final moments that made facing death bearable. The performance of Bink's sake that served as their farewell was simultaneously the finest concert they had ever given and the most heartbreaking experience any of them had ever endured, voices dropping out one by one as their owners succumbed to poisons that no medical knowledge could counteract. The gradual transition from full crew harmony to Brooks' solo voice created musical representation of loss that was almost too painful to witness. The 50 years of solitude that followed Brooks' resurrection were marked by memories that became both comfort and torture his recollections of happier times providing emotional sustenance, while serving as constant reminder of everything that had been lost to forces beyond his control. The ship that had once echoed with laughter and music became floating tomb, where he kept vigil over the remains of dreams that had died before they could reach fruition. His commitment to maintaining the promise they had made to Laboon provided structure for existence that might otherwise have descended into madness. The knowledge that someone still waited for their return, giving purpose to continued existence that served no other function than honoring obligations that transcended death. The tone dial containing their final performance became his most precious possession, tangible proof that their love and music had not been completely erased by tragedy and time. The encounter with Gecko Moria's forces that cost him his shadow was perhaps inevitable given his location in the Florian Triangle, but the loss it represented went beyond mere inconvenience to encompass fundamental alteration of his relationship with the world of the living. The inability to exist in sunlight made him prisoner of perpetual twilight that matched the emotional darkness in which he had existed since his crew's destruction. The years he spent preparing to reclaim his shadow were marked by training and planning that gave focus to existence that had previously been sustained only by memory and obligation. His understanding that defeating the zombies that had stolen his reflection would require skills and knowledge that went beyond what he had possessed during his original lifetime. The salt that proved effective against Moria's creatures became symbol of hope, that even the most hopeless situations might contain seeds of their own resolution. The final battle with the zombie that wore his shadow was simultaneously confrontation with his own stolen identity and test of everything he had learned during decades of solitary preparation, his defeat serving as reminder that some challenges could not be overcome through individual effort alone. The arrival of allies who shared his determination to reclaim what had been stolen provided the assistance that made victory possible where solo efforts had proven inadequate. The Fishman district sprawled beneath the ocean's surface like a monument to segregation and simmering resentment, its cramped quarters and inadequate facilities serving as constant reminder of the second-class status that society had imposed upon those whose only crime was being born different from the human majority that controlled the surface world. Within this underwater ghetto, children grew up learning that their heritage was simultaneously source of pride and cause for persecution. Their natural advantages in aquatic environments overshadowed by the systematic discrimination that limited their opportunities and poisoned their dreams. Jinbei's earliest memories were shaped by the contradictions that defined Fishman existence. His prodigious talent for their traditional martial arts, providing him with sense of accomplishment and identity, while the broader world beyond their island made clear that such achievements would never be recognized or respected by those who held real power. The orphanage that raised him alongside Arlong and countless other children whose families had been destroyed by human prejudice and violence was simultaneously sanctuary and prison, protecting them from immediate harm while preparing them for lives of limitation and struggle. The Fishman karate that he mastered with unprecedented speed was more than mere combat technique. It was cultural inheritance that connected him to centuries of tradition and identity that the surface world had spent generations trying to suppress or erase. His achievement in earning a black belt while still a child was remarkable, not just for its precocity, but for what it represented about the potential that could flourish when nurturing environment provided proper support and encouragement for natural talents. His service in the Neptunian army was motivated by genuine desire to protect his homeland and its people, though his understanding of how such protection might best be achieved was complicated by his growing awareness of the political realities that governed relationships between Fishman Island and the surface powers that claimed authority over their underwater kingdom. The uniform he wore, represented both honor and compromise, service to ideals. He believed in conflicting with policies that often seemed designed to appease those who viewed his people as curiosities or threats, rather than fellow citizens deserving of equal treatment. The philosophical divide that separated him from Queen Otohime's integration efforts was rooted not in malice or racial supremacy, but in hard-earned cynicism about human nature and the likelihood that centuries of prejudice could be overcome through appeals to conscience or reason. His experiences had taught him that hatred was deeply embedded in human culture, passed down through generations like inherited disease, that infected each new cohort with the same fears and misconceptions that had justified oppression for longer than most historians cared to acknowledge. Yet even as he questioned the wisdom of Otohime's peaceful approach, Jinbei's fundamental decency prevented him from allowing such philosophical differences to translate into active opposition or sabotage of her efforts. His protection of the petition signatures that she had worked so hard to collect demonstrated the complex nature of his character, someone whose skepticism about ultimate success was balanced by unwillingness to permit the destruction of hope that others had invested their hearts in pursuing. The playful antagonism that characterized his relationship with Arlong during their youth was typical of close friends who expressed affection through mock combat and competitive banter, though beneath the surface of their rivalry lay deeper disagreements about how their people should respond to the discrimination and violence that seemed to be their permanent lot. Where Jinbei sought pragmatic solutions that might gradually improve their circumstances, Arlong increasingly embraced anger and resentment as both explanation for their suffering and justification for whatever retaliation might eventually become possible. Fisher Tiger's return from his mysterious journey transformed the political landscape of Fishman Island in ways that none of them could have predicted. His heroic raid on Mariahua representing the kind of direct action against oppression that inspired hope, while simultaneously creating new dangers that would affect everyone who shared his heritage. The slaves he had liberated from the celestial dragons were living testimony to the systematic cruelty that characterized the relationship between surface dwellers and those they considered inferior, their stories providing concrete evidence of what happened when power was exercised without moral restraint. The decision to join the Sun Pirates was perhaps inevitable, given Jinbei's growing understanding that conventional approaches to achieving justice for his people were inadequate to address the scope and intensity of the problems they faced. Tiger's philosophy of liberation through direct action resonated with something deep within his character, though he brought to their shared mission the kind of moral framework that prevented righteous anger from degenerating into mere vengeance or cruelty for its own sake. The sun symbol that was branded over the marks of celestial dragon ownership served multiple purposes beyond mere concealment of previous bondage, creating visual representation of unity that transcended the divisions between former slaves and those who had always been free. The painful process of receiving this brand was simultaneously initiation ritual and political statement, declaration that they were creating new identity that owed nothing to the classifications that others had imposed upon them. Tiger's insistence that they kill no humans during their liberation activities was perhaps the most controversial aspect of his leadership, though Jinbei gradually came to understand the wisdom that underlied what initially seemed like unnecessary restraint. The strategic thinking that recognized killing as tactical mistake rather than moral weakness demonstrated sophistication that went far beyond simple desire for revenge against those who had caused suffering to their people. The philosophical discussions that took place during their voyages revealed the depth of Tiger's understanding about the cyclical nature of hatred and violence. His recognition that every human death would be used to justify increased persecution of fishmen, while providing those who benefited from the current system with propaganda that painted them as dangerous monsters deserving of whatever treatment they received. The restraint he demanded was not weakness, but strategic choice, based on clear-eyed assessment of long-term consequences. The battles with marine forces that sought to recapture escaped slaves provided Jinbei with his first real taste of surface world warfare, combat that was complicated by moral considerations that had never applied to his previous martial arts training or military service. Fighting to protect people who had suffered unimaginable cruelty while simultaneously avoiding lethal force against their pursuers required psychological discipline that was perhaps more challenging than the physical demands of battle itself. Vice Admiral Borsellino's involvement in their pursuit demonstrated the seriousness with which the world government viewed their liberation activities. The deployment of such high-ranking officers against what was essentially a humanitarian mission, revealing the true priorities of those who claimed to represent justice and order. The fact that freeing slaves was considered criminal activity, deserving of military response, spoke volumes about the moral bankruptcy of the system they were challenging. The years that followed their initial escape were marked by increasing notoriety and escalating government response. Each successful liberation mission adding to both their legend and the bounties that were placed upon their heads. Jinbei's evolution from reluctant participant to dedicated leader reflected his growing understanding that some causes were worth any personal cost, that the freedom of those who could not free themselves justified whatever risks such efforts might entail. The encounter with young Koala marked a turning point in Jinbei's understanding of both human nature and the complexity of the problems they were trying to address. Her traumatic conditioning, serving as a horrific example of what slavery did to its victims, beyond the obvious physical abuse and exploitation. The broken child who could not stop smiling or apologizing represented the psychological dimension of oppression that would require healing measured in generations rather than years. Her terror at their approach, despite their obvious intention to help rather than harm her, illustrated the depth of conditioning that had been imposed upon someone whose only experience of fishmen had come through the filter of prejudice and propaganda that portrayed them as monsters rather than people. The careful process of earning her trust while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to eventually return her to her family required patience and wisdom that tested everyone involved. Fisher Tiger's decision to brand her with their sun symbol was motivated by recognition that the mark of celestial dragon ownership would condemn her to a lifetime of psychological torment, constant reminder of trauma that should be allowed to heal rather than preserved as permanent scar. The pain he inflicted was an act of kindness that required him to cause immediate suffering in order to prevent decades of continued anguish. The gradual transformation in Koala's behavior as she began to understand that these fishmen meant her no harm provided hope that the prejudices that seemed so deeply embedded in human culture might not be as permanent as they appeared, that individual relationships could overcome even the most systematic indoctrination when supported by patience and genuine care. Her eventual tears were a sign of healing rather than weakness, proof that her capacity for normal human emotion had not been permanently destroyed. The philosophical discussions that her presence sparked among the crew revealed the complexity of their mission and the various approaches that might be taken to address the root causes of discrimination and oppression. Jinbei's growing belief that understanding and communication might be possible between species was challenged by Arlong's insistence that humans were inherently evil and incapable of genuine change, their debate reflecting larger questions about whether peaceful coexistence was a realistic goal or naive fantasy. The weeks spent traveling toward Koala's home island provided opportunity for her to observe fishmen in their natural state, rather than through the lens of fear and prejudice that had previously shaped all her interactions with their species. Her questions about their abilities and customs demonstrated genuine curiosity that had survived her traumatic experiences, suggesting that the capacity for learning and growth remained intact despite everything she had endured. The tears shed by even the most hardened crew members, when the time came to say goodbye to her, reflected the emotional bonds that had developed, despite their initial reluctance to become attached to someone whose presence among them was necessarily temporary. Her impact on their understanding of human potential was perhaps more significant than they realized at the time, proof that individuals could transcend the limitations imposed by their cultural background when given proper opportunity and support. Tiger's decision to personally escort her to her village, rather than delegating this responsibility to subordinates, demonstrated his recognition of both the importance of the mission and the personal risks that such direct involvement might entail. His willingness to expose himself to potential danger for the sake of ensuring her safe return revealed the depth of care that motivated all their liberation activities, though such noble intentions would ultimately prove insufficient protection against the betrayal that awaited them. The treachery that resulted in Tiger's ambush was perhaps inevitable given the rewards that were offered for information leading to his capture, though the fact that it came from people whose child they had just returned safely added layers of moral complexity that made the betrayal particularly difficult to understand or forgive. The villagers' decision to trade their daughter's rescuer for government gold represented the kind of calculated evil that was more disturbing than straightforward hatred or prejudice. The battle that followed was desperate struggle, not just for survival, but for vindication of everything they had worked to achieve. Tiger's wounds serving as physical manifestation of the psychological damage that such betrayal inflicted upon someone whose entire worldview was built around belief in the possibility of redemption and cooperation between species. The irony that his commitment to avoiding human casualties made him vulnerable to attack by those he had sought to protect was not lost on anyone who understood the true nature of what had occurred. The offer of human blood that could save his life became final test of principles that had guided his entire adult existence. His refusal to accept transfusion that might preserve his body at the cost of his spiritual integrity, representing commitment to ideals that transcended mere survival. The philosophical consistency that prevented him from accepting help from the species he had spent years trying to redeem was simultaneously admirable and tragic. His confession about his own experience as slave provided context for understanding the sources of both his compassion for others who had suffered similar fate and his inability to completely overcome the psychological wounds that such trauma had inflicted upon his own spirit. The revelation that he had escaped once before but returned to free others demonstrated heroism that went far beyond simple self-preservation to encompass genuine sacrifice for the welfare of those who could not help themselves. The final wisdom he shared with his surviving crew members was perhaps his greatest gift to them. His recognition that the hatred and prejudice that had shaped their generation might not be permanent features of human nature, but learned behaviors that could potentially be unlearned by those who had never been exposed to such systematic indoctrination. His faith in Koala's generation represented hope that transcended his own ability to forgive or forget. The promise he extracted that they would never reveal the true circumstances of the betrayal that led to his death was motivated by understanding that such knowledge would only perpetuate the cycle of hatred and mistrust that had already caused so much suffering to both species. His determination to protect the possibility of future reconciliation, even at the cost of his own reputation, demonstrated wisdom that recognized larger goals as more important than personal vindication. Jinbei's assumption of leadership following Tiger's death was accompanied by commitment to honor both the letter and spirit of his mentor's final wishes, his continuation of their no-kill policy serving as living memorial to someone whose moral courage had provided example that no amount of personal suffering could be allowed to compromise. The philosophy that had guided Tiger's approach to liberation became foundation for Jinbei's own understanding of how lasting change might be achieved. The letter he sent to Ryugu Palace, explaining what had really happened, represented his determination to ensure that those who were working toward peaceful solutions would have accurate information upon which to base their decisions, even though revealing the truth about human betrayal might undermine Queen Otohime's integration efforts. His commitment to honesty, even when it served no strategic purpose, demonstrated character that valued truth above convenience or political expediency. The years that followed were marked by gradual increase in his reputation and bounty, as the world government recognized him as a significant threat to their policies of oppression and exploitation, though his approach to piracy remained fundamentally different from those who pursued wealth or power for their own sake. The $250 berry price placed on his head reflected not criminal activity, but political resistance to systems that treated entire populations as expendable in service to maintaining existing power structures. The offer of warlord status represented opportunity to legitimize his activities while potentially improving conditions for his people, though accepting such position required compromises that conflicted with some of his deepest principles. His decision to join the Seven Warlords was motivated by hope that working within the system might prove more effective than continued opposition from outside, even though such cooperation required him to make accommodations that felt like betrayals of everything Tiger had died trying to achieve. The release of Arlong from Impel Down was perhaps the most controversial decision of his tenure as warlord. His belief that even his former friend deserved chance for redemption conflicting with evidence that years of imprisonment had only intensified the hatred and resentment that had always been part of Arlong's character. The refusal to execute someone whose crimes had been motivated by the same suffering they had both experienced represented mercy that proved tragically misplaced. The consequences that followed Arlong's freedom would haunt Jinbei for years to come, his former friend's reign of terror in the East Blue serving as constant reminder of what happened when good intentions were not supported by accurate assessment of human character and capability for change. The suffering inflicted upon Kokoyashi village and countless other communities was legacy of compassion that had been extended to someone who lacked capacity for genuine reformation. The refusal to participate in the war at Marineford represented return to the principles that had originally motivated his opposition to world government policies. His recognition that some conflicts required individuals to choose sides based on moral considerations rather than legal obligations. His willingness to risk imprisonment rather than fight against Whitebeard demonstrated loyalty to values that transcended formal agreements or political convenience. The cell in Impel Down, where he eventually found himself confined, became place of reflection and preparation for whatever role he might play in the changes that seemed to be approaching. His conversations with Portgas D. Ace providing him with new understanding of the younger generation that might inherit the world their struggles were helping to create. The bonds formed in those dark depths would prove crucial when circumstances eventually required action that could only be taken by those willing to risk everything for the sake of others who deserved better than the world had previously offered them. And so we reached the end of our journey through the shadows that shaped the light, the individual sorrows that became collective strength when woven together by bonds stronger than blood or circumstance. Each story we have traced tonight reveals the same fundamental truth, that the greatest treasures are not found but forged, not discovered but created through the alchemy of shared suffering, transformed into unshakable loyalty. From Luffy's early lessons about the price of protection to Robin's 20 years of solitude, from Brook's 50-year vigil to Jinbei's struggle to bridge worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict, we have witnessed how pain became purpose, how loss became love, how dreams survived even when dreamers did not. The Straw Hat Pirates are more than mere crew. They are living proof that families can be chosen, that homes can be built from hope rather than inherited from blood. Each member's past prepared them not just for the adventures that lay ahead, but for the moment when they would find others who understood that some bonds transcend death itself, that some promises are worth keeping regardless of cost, that some dreams are worth sharing even when sharing means risking everything. Rest now, gentle dreamer, and let these tales of resilience carry you toward peaceful sleep. In your dreams, may you find the same courage that transformed 9 broken souls into something approaching legend, the understanding that no one is born into this world to be alone, and that somewhere on the vast ocean of possibility, your own crew awaits.